The rain had been falling for 6 hours straight by the time we positioned ourselves along Lower Walker Drive, and it showed no sign of letting up. I could hear it hammering against the concrete ceiling above us, a dull, rhythmic percussion that echoed through the multi-level street system like a drum line nobody asked for. The sound mixed with the occasional hiss of tires on wet pavement from the upper deck, creating a white noise that would have been calming under different circumstances. But tonight, with my heart rate climbing and my hands going numb inside their gloves, the rain just felt oppressive, like the city itself was trying to drown out whatever was about to happen down here in the dark. I adjusted my position behind the concrete pillar, feeling the rough surface catch on my jacket. My name is Special Agent Alaric Dunleavy, and I'd been with the Chicago field office for 9 years, long enough to know that surveillance operations in Lower Wacker never went the way they were supposed to. The underground roadway was a labyrinth of support columns, service corridors, and blind corners that made visual tracking nearly impossible even in daylight. At night, in the rain, with minimal street lighting and the perpetual fog that rose from the Chicago River just a block east, it became something else entirely. It became the kind of place where you could lose a target in the time it took to blink, where radio signals bounced off concrete and steel until your earpiece filled with static, where the chain of custody on evidence could fall apart because you couldn't maintain constant visual contact for more than 30 seconds at a time. Heads up, primary vehicle approaching from the west. The voice in my ear belonged to Teus O'Rourke, our intelligence analyst who was positioned 3 blocks away in a surveillance van that probably smelled like coffee and stress by now. Her tone was calm, almost casual, but I'd worked with her long enough to hear the undercurrent of tension. Black Suburban, no front plate visible, 2 occupants, speed approximately 15 miles per hour. I pressed the transmit button on my radio twice, our signal for acknowledgement without breaking radio silence, and shifted my weight to get a better angle on the street. 50 feet to my right, I could just barely make out the shape of the technical surveillance specialist we'd borrowed from the evidence response team. Quillon Mercer was his name, and this was our first operation together. He was crouched behind an abandoned construction barrier, his equipment case open beside him, probably running through a mental checklist of every sensor and recording device he'd planted along this stretch of road over the past 4 days. I'd read his file before the operation briefing. Former Army Signals Intelligence, 2 tours overseas recruited by the Bureau 5 years ago, and quickly established himself as one of the best TSS operators in the Great Lakes region. The file also noted that he was meticulous to the point of obsession, which was exactly what you wanted in someone responsible for gathering evidence that would hold up in federal court. The headlights appeared first, cutting through the darkness and fog like searchlights. The Suburban moved slowly, cautiously, exactly the way you'd expect a vehicle to move when the driver knew they were doing something they shouldn't be. It passed my position and continued east toward the river, toward the drop point we'd identified through 3 months of Title III wiretaps and financial transaction analysis. This whole operation stemmed from an organized crime investigation that had started small. Some irregularities in shipping manifests at a logistics company in the Calumet Industrial Corridor and had metastasized into something much larger. Money laundering, likely. Trafficking, possibly. The exact nature of what was being moved through these midnight exchanges remained unclear, which was why we were out here in the cold and rain instead of executing arrest warrants from the comfort of a warm office. Vehicle stopping at the designated location, Thais reported. Driver exiting. No passenger movement yet. I pulled out my monocular and trained it on the Suburban's position, approximately 80 yards away. The driver was a heavy-set man in a dark jacket, moving with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested he'd done this before. He walked to the rear of the vehicle, opened the cargo door, and stood there waiting. Just stood there, hands in pockets, head on a swivel, checking sightlines and shadows. Professional. That was concerning. In my experience, professionals were the ones who noticed when surveillance got sloppy, who spotted the pattern in random parking spaces, who realized when they were being watched. 3 minutes passed, then 5. The driver remained motionless except for the occasional turn of his head, scanning the area with the kind of systematic attention that made my chest tighten. If he spotted us, if he made any indication that he knew we were here, the whole operation would collapse. We'd been working this investigation for months, building a case piece by careful piece, and it could all evaporate in an instant if one person looked in the wrong direction at the wrong time. That was the thing about organized crime cases. They were fragile in ways that surprised people who'd never worked them. You could have perfect evidence, airtight surveillance, cooperating witnesses ready to testify, and then one small mistake would cause the entire structure to collapse like a house of cards in a wind tunnel. "Second vehicle approaching," Thais said, her voice slightly higher now. "Gray panel van, Illinois commercial plates, coming from the east on Lower Wacker, speed approximately 20 miles per hour." This was it, the actual exchange. My breathing slowed automatically, a response drilled into me through years of training and field work. Beside the construction barrier, I saw a Mercer shift position slightly, probably activating whatever recording equipment he had aimed at the drop point. Everything we observed now would need to be documented with precision. Times, descriptions, chain of custody for any physical evidence we managed to collect. One broken link in that chain, and a defense attorney would shred our case in court, argue that evidence had been contaminated or mishandled, create reasonable doubt in the minds of jurors who were already skeptical of complex financial crimes they didn't fully understand. The panel van pulled up alongside the Suburban, parking parallel to it in a configuration that would have made sense for a loading operation. The van's driver emerged, shorter, thinner, wearing what looked like a maintenance uniform of some kind. He and the Suburban driver exchanged a few words I couldn't hear, then moved to the rear of the van together. The van's back doors swung open, revealing stacked cardboard boxes marked with shipping labels I couldn't read from this distance. "Are you getting this?" I whispered into my radio, knowing that Mercer's equipment was far more sophisticated than my monocular. "Affirmative," he responded, his voice barely audible. "High-resolution video, directional audio, license plate captures on both vehicles. Documentation is solid." The two men began transferring boxes from the panel van to the Suburban, not all of them, I noticed, just 4 specific boxes from the bottom of a stack near the van's rear doors. The rest of the cargo remained untouched. That was interesting. That was very interesting. In the briefings leading up to tonight, we'd assumed this would be a straightforward transfer. One vehicle drops off contraband, the other picks it up, everyone goes their separate ways. But this suggested something more complicated, some kind of substitution or concealment technique where the actual contraband was hidden among legitimate goods. It was smarter than a simple exchange, and it made our job significantly more difficult. The transfer took less than 3 minutes. The men worked quickly but without apparent panic. The kind of smooth efficiency that came from practice. When they finished, the van driver closed his rear doors, exchanged a final few words with the Suburban driver, and returned to his vehicle. Both engines started simultaneously. The van departed first, heading east toward the river access ramps. The Suburban pulled out in the opposite direction, back toward the west in the maze of on-ramps that would take it up to street level and out into the city. "Which one do we follow?" Thais asked, and I could hear the tension in her voice now, no longer bothering to hide it. This was the critical decision, the moment where one wrong choice could lose us everything. I watched the Suburban's taillights recede into the darkness, while the van's engine noise faded toward the river. We had 3 vehicles at our disposal. My unmarked sedan, parked 2 blocks south, Thais' surveillance van, and Mercer's equipment van parked near the Michigan Avenue exit. But 3 vehicles couldn't effectively track 2 targets moving in opposite directions through a city that offered infinite options for losing a tail. We had to choose, and we had to choose immediately. The Suburban, I decided, my voice steadier than I felt. That's where the product is going. The van is just a courier. Thais, coordinate with Mercer, get vehicle descriptions and plates to the watch commander, request additional units to locate and monitor the van, but maintain distance. We stay with the money. Copy that, she replied, already typing commands into her systems. Mercer, did you copy? Affirmative, he responded. Pulling data now. I was already moving toward my vehicle, staying low and using the support columns for cover. The Suburban had a head start, but it was still visible when I reached my sedan, a dark blue Crown Victoria that screamed Federal Agent, despite technically being unmarked. I slid behind the wheel, started the engine without turning on my headlights, and began following at a distance I hoped was sufficient to avoid detection. The Suburban continued west, moving through Lower Wacker's curves and straightaways with the same cautious speed it had maintained earlier. No sudden accelerations, no aggressive lane changes, nothing to suggest the driver had spotted surveillance. That was good. That meant we still had a chance to see where this led, to identify the next link in whatever chain we were trying to unravel. Target vehicle is approaching the exit ramp at Clinton Street, I reported, watching the Suburban's brake lights flare as it slowed for the turn. Looks like they're heading up to street level. Copy, Thais said. Be advised, we're getting some interference on the radio frequencies. Might be the storm, might be the concrete structure. If we lose contact, maintain visual on the target and we'll re-establish when you're clear of the underground. Static crackled through my earpiece, punctuating her warning. That was another joy of working Lower Wacker, the radio dead zones, the places where concrete and steel created electromagnetic shadows that swallowed communications like black holes. If I lost contact with my team, I'd be operating on my own judgment, making decisions without backup or guidance, with no way to call for help if something went wrong. The Suburban took the Clinton Street ramp, and I followed, maintaining a 3-car buffer that dissolved to a 1-car buffer when we reached street level and encountered the minimal late-night traffic. Rain continued to hammer down, reducing visibility to maybe 50 feet, making it easier to stay close without being spotted but harder to see where we were actually going. The Suburban turned north on Clinton, then east on Lake Street, moving into the West Loop with its mix of old warehouses and new development. Trendy restaurants closed for the night and luxury apartment buildings with lobbies that stayed lit around the clock. Thais, are you reading me? I said into the radio, getting only static in response. I tried again. Mercer? Anyone? Nothing. The dead zone had swallowed my communications, leaving me isolated in a marked sedan, trailing a vehicle full of contraband through a rainstorm in the middle of the night. This was exactly the kind of scenario that made senior agents shake their heads during training sessions, the kind of situation they warned you to avoid, but that somehow became inevitable once you spent enough time in the field. The Suburban continued east, passing under the elevated train tracks at Wells Street, moving toward the river again. We were circling back, I realized, coming around to the northeast and heading toward the area we'd just left. That didn't make sense. Why transfer the boxes and then immediately return to the general vicinity? Unless... The thought was interrupted by the Suburban's sudden turn into an underground parking garage, one of the private facilities that served the office buildings in this part of the loop. I had maybe 2 seconds to decide whether to follow or maintain external surveillance. Following meant committing fully, potentially getting trapped in the garage's confined space if things went bad. Staying outside meant possibly losing the target if there was another exit, or if they transferred vehicles inside the garage. I followed. The garage entrance swallowed me. Fluorescent lights replacing the darkness of the street. The sound of rain cutting off abruptly to be replaced by the echo of engines in concrete spaces. The Suburban was one level down, moving slowly through the parking lanes, and I followed at what I hoped was a discreet distance. My heart was hammering now, my hands tight on the wheel, every instinct screaming that I was making a mistake, but unable to identify exactly what kind of mistake it was. The Suburban pulled into a parking space on the second sublevel, backing in so the rear doors faced a concrete wall. Smart. That meant anyone approaching would have to come from the front, would be visible through the windshield before they could see what was happening at the back of the vehicle. I parked 2 rows away, killed my engine, and watched. The driver emerged, looked around carefully, then pulled out his phone and appeared to make a call. He spoke for maybe 30 seconds, then returned the phone to his pocket and stood there waiting. Just stood there, exactly like he'd done at the drop point on Lower Wacker, hands in pockets, head on a swivel, watching. Minutes passed. The garage was almost completely empty at this hour. I counted maybe 8 other vehicles on this level, all of them dark and apparently unoccupied. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, creating a flat, shadowless illumination that made everything look slightly unreal, slightly wrong. My radio remained dead, offering nothing but static no matter how many times I checked it. Then I heard it. Footsteps echoing from somewhere above us. Someone was coming down the stairwell at the far end of the garage level. The Suburban driver heard it too. His posture changed, became more alert but not defensive. He was expecting someone. The stairwell door opened and 2 figures emerged, both wearing dark clothing, both moving with purpose. They approached the Suburban directly. No hesitation, no caution. These weren't random pedestrians who happened to be in the garage. These were part of whatever was happening here. I slid lower in my seat, trying to become invisible while maintaining sight lines on the Suburban. This was it, I thought. This was where I'd find out what all the surveillance and wiretaps and financial analysis had been pointing toward. This was where the case would break open or collapse entirely. The 3 men, the Suburban driver and the 2 newcomers, converged at the rear of the vehicle. They spoke briefly, their voices too low for me to hear clearly. Then the driver opened the rear doors and gestured inside. One of the newcomers leaned in, examining the boxes we'd watched being transferred on Lower Wacker. He pulled one box out partway, opened it, and removed something I couldn't quite see from my angle. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me badly enough that I nearly knocked it to the floor. I pulled it out carefully, saw Thais's number on the screen, answered with a whisper. "Yeah? Where are you?" Her voice was strained. "We lost your signal 15 minutes ago." "Underground parking garage, 300 block of East Lake Street," I whispered back, keeping my eyes on the scene at the Suburban. Target made a stop, meeting with 2 additional subjects. They're examining the transferred boxes now. "Alaric, we have a problem." The use of my first name made my stomach drop. Thais only abandoned call signs and radio protocol when something was seriously wrong. The panel van from the drop point, it just showed up on a traffic camera heading back into Lower Wacker, same section where we conducted the surveillance. It's like they're doing a second run, or maybe checking to see if anyone was watching. My mind raced through the implications. If they were checking for surveillance, that meant they suspected something, which meant our operation might already be compromised. And if the van was making a return trip while the Suburban was here in this garage, then... "Thais," I said slowly, "what if the boxes in the Suburban aren't the actual product? What if those 4 boxes we watched them transfer were just decoys?" Silence on the other end of the line, then, "You're saying the real contraband is still in the van?" "Or it was never in the van in the first place," I replied. watching as the two newcomers at the Suburban closed the box they'd been examining and pushed it back into place. What if the whole drop point operation was designed to draw attention away from something else? Then we've been following the wrong target all night, Thais said quietly. At the Suburban, the three men were concluding their meeting. The driver closed the rear doors while the two newcomers headed back toward the stairwell they'd emerged from. Normal conclusion to a normal meeting, nothing suspicious, nothing actionable. Except that every instinct I'd developed over 9 years of federal law enforcement was screaming that something was wrong with this picture. That we'd been misdirected somehow, that the real operation was happening somewhere else while we chased shadows in an underground parking garage. Get Mercer on the line, I told Thais. Find out everything his equipment captured at the drop point. Audio, video, anything that might tell us what we actually witnessed. And pull up the surveillance footage from the last time we observed activity at that location. I want to compare it to tonight. On it, she replied. What are you going to do? I watched the Suburban driver return to his vehicle, watched him start the engine and begin backing out of the parking space. I'm going to keep following this target, I said. Even if it's a decoy, whoever's running this operation put significant resources into making it look legitimate. That means there's still something here worth pursuing. Be careful, Thais warned. If they know they're being watched, they might be leading you somewhere deliberately. The thought had already occurred to me, but hearing it spoken aloud made it more real, more threatening. I ended the call and started my engine as the Suburban completed its turn and headed toward the garage exit. Rain hit my windshield again as we emerged back onto Lake Street, the storm still raging, the city still dark except for scattered streetlights and the occasional lit window in the buildings rising on either side of us. The Suburban turned north on Michigan Avenue, heading away from the loop now into the neighborhoods that spread out north and west from the downtown core. I followed, maintaining distance, trying to piece together a coherent theory from the fragments of information we'd gathered tonight. A staged drop point, decoy boxes, a return trip by the courier vehicle, a brief meeting in a parking garage. None of it fit together in a way that made sense. Unless making sense wasn't the point. Unless the entire operation was designed to create confusion, to overwhelm surveillance resources, to make investigators question their own observations until they couldn't distinguish signal from noise. My radio crackled back to life as we moved away from the interference zones around Lower Wacker. Alaric, this is Mercer. His voice was tight with stress. I've been reviewing the footage from tonight's drop point. There's something you need to know about those boxes. Go ahead, I said, watching the Suburban navigate through the rain-slicked streets. The boxes they transferred from the van to the Suburban. Mercer paused, and I could hear him typing in the background, pulling up data. They weren't the same boxes I saw them load into the van when it left the warehouse this afternoon. The dimensions are similar. The labels look identical. But there are subtle differences in the packaging tape patterns, in the way the labels are positioned. I ran the footage through comparison software to be sure, but I'm certain now. At some point between leaving the warehouse and arriving at Lower Wacker, they switched out the boxes. My hands tightened on the steering wheel. So what we saw being transferred tonight were substitutes, Mercer finished. The real boxes, whatever they contained, never made it to Lower Wacker. They were replaced with decoys somewhere en route. Which means the actual drop happened somewhere else, I said, feeling the case shift underneath me like sand. Somewhere we weren't watching. Exactly. Mercer's voice carried a note of professional frustration. The sound of someone who prided himself on technical precision discovering he'd been outmaneuvered. And if they went to that much trouble to misdirect us, it means they knew we were watching. They knew, and they planned for it. The implications crashed over me like a wave. Our surveillance had been compromised. Somehow, someone in the organization we'd been investigating had learned about the Title III wiretaps, about our observations, about our entire operational framework. And instead of just canceling their activities and going dark, they'd used that knowledge against us, turned our own surveillance protocols into weapons, fed us false information while conducting the real operation somewhere beyond our visibility. "Thais," I said into the radio, "how many vehicles do we have available right now?" "Just yours and mine," she replied. "Mercer's van isn't equipped for mobile surveillance, and we can't get additional units allocated without going through the watch commander, which would require explaining why we need them. And we can't explain that without admitting we might have compromised the investigation," I finished. That was the impossible situation we'd found ourselves in, needing help but unable to ask for it, pursuing a target that might be leading us nowhere while the real operation unfolded beyond our reach. The Suburban continued north, past Chicago Avenue, past Division Street, entering the neighborhoods where wealthy residents lived in brownstones that cost millions and homeless people slept in doorways 20 feet away. The contradictions of the city laid out in geographic form, visible in every block. "Where's he going?" Thais asked, tracking my position through the GPS in my phone. "I don't know," I admitted. "Maybe nowhere. Maybe he's just driving around until his associates tell him the real operation is complete." "So we abort?" I thought about it. Thought about the months of work we'd invested in this investigation, the late nights and cold coffee and bureaucratic forms filed in triplicate to justify every minute of surveillance time and every dollar of operational budget. Thought about going back to the office and explaining to the assistant special agent in charge that we'd been played, that our entire investigative approach had been anticipated and countered by people we'd underestimated. "No," I said, "we stay with him. Even if this is a decoy operation, even if the real contraband is somewhere else, there's still a pattern here. Eventually, he'll have to meet with someone, report to someone, go somewhere that matters. And when he does, we'll be watching." It wasn't a great plan. It wasn't even a good plan. But it was the only plan we had that didn't involve admitting defeat and walking away from 9 months of investigative work. The Suburban turned west on North Avenue, heading away from the lake now, into neighborhoods I knew less well. Old manufacturing districts being converted to mixed-use development. Warehouses becoming loft apartments. Industrial corridors being rezoned for commercial use. The city reinventing itself block by block, building by building, leaving behind the people and businesses that couldn't afford the transformation. "Target is slowing," I reported, watching the Suburban's brake lights. "Looks like he's pulling into a parking lot. Stand by." The lot served a cluster of old warehouse buildings, the kind of structures that had been built a century ago to serve industries that no longer existed. Some had been renovated into office space or artist studios, but most still looked abandoned, their windows broken or boarded up, their loading docks sealed with rusted metal gates. The Suburban pulled around to the back of one of these buildings, out of sight from the street. I killed my headlights and coasted to a stop at the lot's entrance, trying to decide whether to follow or maintain external observation. Through the rain, I could just barely see the Suburban's taillights disappear behind the building. "He's out of visual," I reported. "I'm going to try to get a better angle." "Alaric, be careful," Thais warned. "If this is a setup—" "I know," I interrupted. "But we're already committed. Might as well see it through." I eased my sedan into the parking lot, moving slowly to minimize engine noise, trying to stay in the shadows cast by the buildings. The rain helped mask my approach, but it also reduced visibility to the point where I was essentially navigating blind. I rounded the corner of the nearest warehouse and spotted the Suburban, now parked beside a loading dock at the back of the building. The driver was out of the vehicle, talking to someone. No, not someone. Multiple people. 4 or 5 figures, all wearing dark clothing, all gathered around the Suburban's rear doors. This wasn't a decoy operation, this was real. I grabbed my phone to call Thais, but before I could dial, the loading dock door began to roll upward, revealing a lit interior space and more people inside. The Suburban driver opened his rear doors and the group began unloading the boxes we'd watched being transferred on lower Wacker. They were moving quickly now, urgently, getting everything inside and out of sight as fast as possible. "Thais," I said quietly into my phone, "I've got active transfer at an industrial location on North Avenue. Multiple subjects, they're unloading the Suburban into a warehouse. I need backup, and I need the evidence response team ready to execute a search warrant." "How many subjects?" she asked, and I could hear her keyboard already clattering as she started documenting everything. "At least 7 visible, possibly more inside the building." I tried to get license plate numbers on the vehicles parked near the loading dock, but the rain and darkness made it nearly impossible. "They're moving fast, like they know they're operating on a timeline." "I'm pulling the property records now," Thais said. "The warehouse is... okay, it's owned by a shell company registered in Delaware. Cross-referencing with our case files. Jesus, Alaric, this property came up in the financial analysis 6 weeks ago. We flagged it as a potential money laundering vehicle, but deprioritized it because the transaction volumes were too small to warrant immediate attention. So they're smarter than we gave them credit for," I muttered, watching the last of the boxes disappear into the warehouse. They spread their operations across multiple properties, kept everything below the threshold that would trigger automatic flags, coordinated activities across jurisdictions to make pattern recognition harder. "That's organized crime 101, Thais replied. "But the level of sophistication here, this isn't street-level distribution, this is something bigger." The Suburban driver closed his rear doors and climbed back into the vehicle. The loading dock door began rolling down again, sealing off my view of the warehouse interior. In 30 seconds, the scene would look completely normal, just another industrial building in a neighborhood full of them, indistinguishable from hundreds of similar structures across the city. "He's leaving," I reported as the Suburban's engine started. "Do I follow him or stay here?" "Stay there," Thais decided. "Mercer is en route to your location with the surveillance equipment. We'll set up external observation and try to determine what's happening inside that warehouse. If we're lucky, we can identify enough people and activities to support a warrant application. And if we're not lucky, then we spend another 6 months building the case and hope they don't realize we're watching." The Suburban pulled out of the lot and disappeared into the rain, leaving me alone with a warehouse full of suspects and questions I couldn't answer. I moved my sedan to a position with better sight lines on the loading dock, killed my engine, and settled in to wait. This was the part of surveillance work they never showed in movies, the long, boring stretches where nothing happened, and you just sat in a car trying to stay awake while rain hammered on the roof and your coffee went cold and your legs went numb. Hours could pass like this, sometimes entire days, waiting for something to occur that might or might not be significant, documenting everything in meticulous detail in case it became relevant later. Mercer arrived 40 minutes later, his equipment van pulling into position 2 blocks away where he could set up directional microphones and infrared cameras without being obvious about it. I met him there, grateful to stretch my legs and talk to another human being after the isolation of solo surveillance. "What have we got?" he asked, already unpacking equipment from the back of his van. "Warehouse operation, probably distribution or repackaging," I replied, filling him in on everything I'd observed. At least 7 suspects inside, possibly more. They brought in 4 boxes from the Suburban, the same boxes we saw transferred on Lower Wacker, the ones you identified as substitutes. So, either they're very good at making their decoys look authentic, Mercer said, adjusting the focus on a camera mounted to the van's roof, or we're wrong about which boxes are real and which are fake. Or the boxes are irrelevant, I suggested, the thought crystallizing as I spoke it aloud. What if the boxes aren't the contraband at all? What if they're just containers, just a way to move something else? Mercer paused in his equipment setup and looked at me. Like what? I don't know, I admitted. Information, maybe. Digital data on hard drives disguised to look like something innocuous, or documents, financial records, identity papers, things that would be worth a lot to the right buyers but wouldn't show up on an X-ray or trigger a drug dog. That would explain why they went to so much trouble with the misdirection, Mercer said thoughtfully. Physical contraband you can catch with traditional interdiction methods. But information? He shook his head. Information you have to know to look for. You have to understand the context, the network, the relationships between seemingly unrelated data points. Which is exactly what we've been trying to build for the past 9 months, I said. The wiretaps, the financial analysis, the surveillance. We've been mapping the network. And now they're using that map against us, feeding us false positives while they conduct the real operation somewhere in our blind spots. My phone buzzed with a call from Thais. Yeah, I answered. We have a problem, she said, and the stress in her voice made my chest tighten. The panel van from the original drop point, the one that showed up on traffic cameras returning to Lower Wacker, it just appeared again, this time on the south side, in the Calumet Industrial Corridor. Where exactly? I asked. Outside a metal fabrication plant on 100th Street, near the Bishop Ford Freeway. The plant showed up in our case files as a possible front for money laundering activity. And Alaric? She paused. The van's driver appears to be making another exchange. Same protocol as Lower Wacker. Parks, waits, meets with another vehicle, transfers boxes. So there were 2 operations tonight, I said slowly, understanding dawning. The one on Lower Wacker that we followed, and a second one on the south side that we missed entirely. They split our attention, made us choose which target to follow, then conducted both operations, knowing we could only watch one. It's worse than that, Thais replied. I've been reviewing our surveillance logs from the past 6 months. Every time we've observed suspicious activity at one location, there have been similar timestamps for different locations across the city. We thought they were unrelated incidents, but what if they were coordinated? What if they've been running multiple simultaneous operations every time, knowing we don't have enough resources to monitor everything at once? Then we've only been seeing a fraction of their actual activity, I finished. We've been documenting the decoys while the real operations happen beyond our visibility. Exactly! Thais sounded exhausted. And if that's true, then our entire investigation might be compromised. Everything we think we know might be wrong. I looked at the warehouse, at the loading dock where boxes had disappeared into darkness, at the rain-soaked streets that could hide 100 operations just like this one. Somewhere in the city, people were moving contraband, whatever form that contraband took, through a network we'd only partially mapped, using protocols we'd only partially understood. And they were doing it with the confidence that came from knowing they'd stayed several steps ahead of us every time we thought we were closing in. We need to make a decision, I said. We can't follow every lead, can't watch every location. We have to prioritize. What do you recommend? Thais asked. I thought about it, weighing options that all seemed equally bad. We We stay here, I decided. Whatever's happening in this warehouse, it's significant enough that they're willing to conduct the operation despite potential surveillance. That means it's time-sensitive, which means it's important. And important means it's worth pursuing even if we're letting other operations proceed elsewhere. All right, Thais agreed reluctantly. But Alaric, when this is over, we need to have a serious conversation about how we've been approaching this investigation. Because if they're really this far ahead of us, then we need to fundamentally rethink our operational protocols. Agreed, I said, and ended the call. Mercer had finished setting up his equipment by the time I returned to the van. Arrays of directional microphones pointed toward the warehouse. Infrared cameras tracked heat signatures through walls. Radio frequency scanners monitored communications in a dozen different bands. It was an impressive technical setup, the kind of surveillance capability that would have seemed like science fiction 20 years ago. "Anything interesting?" I asked. "Some movement inside the warehouse, but the building's structure is interfering with the infrared," Mercer replied, adjusting settings on a laptop screen. "I'm getting maybe 7 or 8 heat signatures, but they're indistinct. Could be people, could be machinery, could be a combination of both. Audio? Nothing clean. Too much ambient noise from the neighborhood. Traffic, trains, other businesses. I can tell there are conversations happening inside, but I can't make out specific words." So we were back to the fundamental problem of surveillance work. Proximity versus discretion. Getting close enough to gather actionable intelligence meant risking detection. Maintaining operational security meant accepting gaps in our information. There was no perfect solution, no way to observe everything while remaining completely invisible. I was about to say something when Mercer suddenly held up a hand for silence. "Wait," he said, tilting his head as if listening to something I couldn't hear. "I'm getting... Okay, there's increased radio frequency activity. Multiple devices transmitting in the 900 megahertz range looks like encrypted communications. Professional-grade encryption, too, not just burner phones. Can you break it?" I asked, knowing the answer before he spoke. "Not in real time, no. I can record everything and submit it for cryptanalysis, but that'll take days or weeks depending on the encryption standard. And by then, whatever they're planning will be complete." "So, we're flying blind," I said. "Not completely blind," Mercer corrected. "We know they're communicating. We know they're using sophisticated equipment. We know they're coordinating activities across multiple locations. That's intelligence, even if it's not as specific as we'd like." My phone buzzed again. Thais calling back. "Yeah?" I answered. "The panel van on the south side?" she said. "It just left the metal fabrication plant and it's heading north. Current trajectory suggests it's returning to Lower Wacker, possibly to the same location where we conducted initial surveillance." They're running a loop, I realized. Multiple stops, multiple exchanges, all coordinated through encrypted communication so we can't predict the next move. It's a continuous operation spread across the entire city, impossible to monitor completely unless we had dozens of surveillance teams. Which we don't have, Thais confirmed. We have 2 agents, 1 analyst, and 1 TSS operator, against an organization that's demonstrated the capability to run simultaneous operations across multiple jurisdictions while maintaining operational security sophisticated enough to detect and counter federal surveillance. "So, what do you want to do?" I asked. Silence on the line for a long moment, then, "I think we need to call this in," Thais said quietly. "Bring in the assistant special agent in charge, request additional resources, admit that we're outmatched and need help. That'll mean explaining everything that's happened tonight," I said, "including the fact that our surveillance was probably compromised, that we followed a decoy target while real operations proceeded elsewhere, that 9 months of investigative work might need to be reevaluated." "I know," she replied. But what's the alternative? We keep following shadows while they run circles around us? We pretend we're in control when we're clearly not? That's not investigation, Alaric, that's just pride. She was right, of course. I knew she was right. But the admission stung anyway. The acknowledgement that we'd been outplayed. That despite all our training and experience and technical capabilities, we'd been consistently wrong-footed by people who understood our methods better than we'd understood theirs. All right, I said, make the call. Request a meeting with the ASAC first thing tomorrow morning. In the meantime, we maintain surveillance here and document everything we can. Even if the operation is compromised, maybe we'll capture something useful. Copy that, Thais said, and disconnected. I returned to the van where Mercer was still monitoring his equipment arrays, watching heat signatures move through the warehouse, recording encrypted communications we couldn't decode, documenting an operation we couldn't fully understand. We're calling it in, I told him, bringing in supervision, requesting additional resources. He nodded without looking away from his screens. Probably the right call, he said. This is bigger than a 3-person team can handle. Yeah, I agreed, but the word felt hollow. We sat in silence for a while, watching the warehouse, listening to rain drum on the van's roof, waiting for something to happen that might make sense of the chaos. Hours passed. 3 a.m. became 4 a.m., then 5. The rain finally started to ease, the storm moving east over Lake Michigan, leaving behind wet streets that reflected pre-dawn light in shattered patterns. At 5:47 a.m., the warehouse loading dock door began to open again. Movement, Mercer said, unnecessarily, pointing at his screens where heat signatures were converging toward the loading dock. Multiple individuals exiting the building, vehicle engines starting. I grabbed my binoculars and trained them on the warehouse. 7 people emerged, the same 7 I'd counted earlier, or at least the same number, and climbed into 3 different vehicles parked near the loading dock. No boxes were visible in their hands, nothing obvious being loaded or transported. Whatever they'd been doing inside the warehouse, it was apparently complete. The vehicles pulled out of the lot in sequence, heading in different directions. One went north, toward the neighborhoods we'd come through earlier. One went west, toward the industrial corridors on the city's edge. And one came directly toward us, forcing me to slump down in the van's passenger seat to avoid being spotted as it passed. "Did you get plates?" I asked Mercer. "On all 3 vehicles," he confirmed, typing rapidly on his laptop. "Submitting them to the database now for cross-reference with our case files. And the warehouse. Any indication of what they left behind?" Mercer adjusted his infrared camera's focus, scanning the building's interior. "Looks empty," he reported. "No significant heat signatures, no movement. If they left anything behind, it's either too small to register or they took it with them." So we'd spent the night watching a warehouse, documenting an operation we didn't understand, following targets that might or might not be relevant to our investigation. And in a few hours, I'd have to sit across from the assistant special agent in charge and explain how we'd arrived at this point, how months of surveillance work had culminated in confusion and uncertainty. My phone buzzed with a text from Thais. "ASAC available at 900. Meeting confirmed. Bring everything." I acknowledged the message and looked at Mercer. "You good to pack up here?" "Yeah," he said. "I'll need another hour to secure all the equipment and download the night's recordings, but I'll have everything ready for the meeting." "All right, I'm going to make one more pass through the area, see if there's anything we missed. Call me if anything changes." I left the van and walked back toward the warehouse, hands in my pockets against the cold morning air, trying to reconcile what we'd observed with what we'd expected to find. The building looked abandoned in the early light, Graffiti-covered walls, broken windows, loading dock sealed again like it had never opened. No indication that anything significant had occurred here. No evidence visible to a casual observer. But that was the point, wasn't it? To operate invisibly, to move contraband, whatever form it took, through the city without leaving traces that investigators could follow. To understand law enforcement methodologies well enough to stay ahead of them. To anticipate surveillance and counter it. To turn investigative techniques against the investigators. I completed a circuit of the building, noting security cameras I hadn't spotted earlier, recording license plate numbers from vehicles that looked abandoned but might be operational, mentally cataloging details that might become relevant later. Then I returned to my sedan and drove away, leaving Mercer to finish his documentation while I headed back toward the field office to prepare for the morning meeting. The city was waking up around me. Early commuters on the roads, businesses opening for the day, normal people living normal lives unaware of the operations that had unfolded in the darkness while they slept. Chicago in transition from night to day, from the hidden world I operated in to the visible world where most people existed. I thought about the boxes we'd followed, about decoys and misdirection, about 9 months of investigation that might need to be reevaluated. Thought about Thais and Mercer and the decisions we'd made tonight, the calls we'd gotten right and the ones we'd gotten wrong. Thought about the assistant special agent in charge and the conversation that was coming, the explanations I'd need to provide, and the questions I wouldn't be able to answer. But mostly I thought about the people in that warehouse, the ones who'd moved boxes in the rain and communicated through encrypted channels and coordinated operations across a city of millions. Thought about how they'd stayed ahead of us, how they'd anticipated our moves, how they'd turned our own capabilities against us. Because that was the real lesson of tonight, I realized. The real lesson was that we'd underestimated our opposition, assumed they were less sophisticated than they'd proven to be, approached the investigation with methods that had worked against previous targets but were inadequate against this one. And that meant everything we thought we knew about this case, every assumption, every conclusion, every operational protocol needed to be questioned. The assistant special agent in charge's office smelled like old coffee and newer anxiety. I'd been sitting across from her desk for 3 minutes while she read through Mercer's preliminary surveillance report, her expression growing darker with each page she turned. Thais stood beside me, her posture rigid in a way that suggested she'd already accepted whatever consequences were coming. Through the office window, I could see the normal morning activity of the Chicago field office. Agents moving between desks, phones ringing, the ordinary machinery of federal law enforcement grinding forward, while we sat here trying to explain how badly the night had gone. The ASAC finally set down the report and looked at us with eyes that had seen too many operations fall apart in exactly this way. Her name was printed on a placard on her desk, but everyone just called her ma'am and left it at that. She'd been with the Bureau for 26 years, worked organized crime in 3 different field offices, and had a reputation for being fair but unforgiving when it came to operational failures. The fact that she'd agreed to this meeting on short notice suggested she already knew something had gone wrong. The question was how wrong, and whether it was recoverable. "Walk me through it again," she said, her voice carrying the flat affect of someone working very hard to remain calm. "From the beginning. No speculation, no theory, just what you observed and what you can document." I glanced at Thais, who gave a slight nod indicating I should take the lead. At approximately 23:47 hours last night, we observed the primary target vehicle, a black suburban, Illinois plates, arrive at the predetermined drop point on Lower Wacker Drive. The vehicle contained 2 occupants. The driver exited and opened the rear cargo door, then waited. At 2352 hours, a second vehicle, gray panel van, commercial plates, arrived from the east and parked parallel to the Suburban. The ASAC was taking notes on a legal pad, her handwriting quick and precise. "This matches your operational plan as filed?" "Yes, ma'am," I confirmed. The drop point was one of 3 locations we'd identified through Title III intercepts and pattern analysis. We had it under surveillance for 4 hours prior to the exchange, confirmed the location was secure for observation. Continue. The van driver exited his vehicle and approached the Suburban driver. They had a brief conversation, less than 30 seconds, too quiet for our directional microphones to capture. Then moved to the rear of the panel van. They transferred 4 boxes from the van to the Suburban. The boxes appeared to be standard shipping containers, approximately 18 inches by 12 inches by 8 inches, marked with commercial shipping labels we couldn't read from our surveillance position. The transfer took approximately 2.5 minutes. "Only 4 boxes?" the ASAC asked, looking up from her notes. "The van was carrying more cargo than that, correct?" "Yes, ma'am," Thais interjected. According to Mercer's pre-operation surveillance, the van was loaded with approximately 20 boxes at the originating warehouse. Only 4 were transferred at Lower Wacker. The ASAC made another note, suggesting the other 16 boxes were either decoys or were designated for different recipients at different locations. "That's our assessment," I agreed. After the transfer, both vehicles departed, the van heading east toward the river, the Suburban heading west. We made the tactical decision to follow the Suburban, based on the assumption that it now contained the actual contraband. "A reasonable assumption," the ASAC said, though her tone suggested she already knew it had been wrong. "What happened next?" I described the pursuit through the city streets, the Suburban's route to the parking garage on East Lake Street, the brief meeting with 2 additional subjects who examined the transferred boxes. The ASAC listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes, her expression growing more concerned as I detailed how our radio communications had failed in the underground structure, how we'd been forced to make decisions without coordination or backup. "At what point did you realize the boxes might be decoys?" she asked. "Not until we received intelligence that the panel van had returned to Lower Wacker," I admitted. Thais observed it on traffic cameras approximately 40 minutes after the initial exchange. That's when we began to suspect the entire drop point operation might have been designed to misdirect our surveillance. "And then we confirmed it," Thais said, stepping forward slightly. Mercer reviewed his surveillance footage and identified discrepancies in the boxes. The ones transferred at Lower Wacker weren't the same boxes that had been loaded into the van at the originating warehouse. They were substitutes, placed in the van at some point, en route that we weren't monitoring. The ASAC set down her pen and leaned back in her chair, the leather creaking slightly. "So, the actual contraband never went through Lower Wacker at all. The entire exchange we observed was theater, performed for our benefit while the real operation proceeded elsewhere." "Yes, ma'am," I confirmed. "And it gets worse. While we were following the Suburban, the panel van conducted at least 1 additional exchange on the south side. Calumet Industrial Corridor, outside a metal fabrication plant. We only discovered this through traffic camera review after the fact." "How many total exchanges do you estimate occurred last night?" Thais consulted her tablet before answering. "Based on traffic camera data and cell tower analysis, we've identified at least 4 separate locations where the panel van stopped for periods consistent with exchange activity. Lower Wacker, the south side location, and 2 others in the West Loop and near Midway Airport. Each stop corresponded with the appearance of other vehicles that matched the pattern of our target organization. 4 simultaneous operations," the ASAC said quietly, more to herself than to us. "Coordinated across the city, designed to overwhelm limited surveillance resources." She paused, then looked directly at me. And the warehouse on North Avenue? The one you maintained observation on for the remainder of the night? We documented 7 individuals entering and exiting, I replied. All appeared to be involved in some kind of organizational activity inside the structure, but we couldn't determine specifics. The building's construction interfered with our infrared surveillance, and they were using encrypted communications we couldn't decrypt in real time. The property is owned by a shell company that appeared in our financial analysis 6 weeks ago, but we'd deprioritized it as a low-value target. Except it wasn't low value, the ASAC said. It was the operational hub, probably one of several, and they kept it below our priority threshold intentionally. She picked up her pen again, tapped it against the desk twice. Here's what concerns me most about your report. This level of operational sophistication, the coordinated exchanges, the decoy protocols, the use of shell companies and encrypted communications. This suggests our targets have detailed knowledge of our investigative methods. They're not just evading surveillance. They're actively countering it using techniques that require understanding of FBI operational protocols. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Thais broke the silence first. You think we have a leak? I think it's a possibility we can't ignore, the ASAC replied. Either someone with access to this investigation has been compromising operational security, or our targets have experience with federal law enforcement that's allowed them to anticipate our methods. Either scenario is deeply problematic. My stomach tightened at the thought. A leak would mean months of investigative work was potentially contaminated. Every operational decision suspect, every piece of evidence questionable. It would mean someone we worked with, someone we trusted, had been feeding information to the people we were trying to catch. And worst of all, it would mean we couldn't trust anyone. Not our colleagues, not our supervisors, maybe not even each other. What do you want us to do? I asked. The ASAC stood and walked to the window, looking out at the office beyond. First, we contain this. The 3 of you, myself and Mercer, are the only people who know the full details of what happened last night. That doesn't change without my explicit authorization. No briefings, no case file updates, no casual conversations with other agents. This information stays compartmentalized until we understand what we're dealing with. Yes, ma'am, we both replied. Second, we re-examine everything. Every piece of intelligence, every surveillance report, every operational decision made in the past 9 months. We assume nothing, trust nothing that hasn't been independently verified. If there's a leak, if someone has been compromising this investigation, we need to find the pattern. The places where information flowed out before operations went wrong. That's going to take time, Thais noted. Potentially weeks. Then we'd better start immediately, the ASAC replied, turning back to face us. Third, we shift our approach. Clearly, traditional surveillance isn't working against these targets. They're too sophisticated, too well prepared, so we change tactics, find new ways to gather intelligence that they won't anticipate. What did you have in mind? I asked. The ASAC returned to her desk and pulled a thin folder from a locked drawer. There's a CI, confidential informant, who contacted us 3 months ago, claiming to have information about organized crime operations in the shipping and logistics sector. At the time, we couldn't corroborate his information with existing intelligence, so we put him on hold. But looking at his debrief notes now, in light of what you observed last night, there are some interesting overlaps. She slid the folder across the desk to me. I opened it and found a standard CI intake form, most of the identifying information redacted except for a case number and a handler designation. The summary section described someone with access to cargo handling operations at multiple facilities across the Chicago area, someone who claimed to have witnessed systematic diversion of legitimate shipments for purposes unknown. The CI mentioned something specific, the ASAC continued. pointing to a highlighted section in the notes. He said the operations he observed always involved ghost boxes, containers that appeared on manifests but contained different contents than what was documented, or sometimes contained nothing at all. He said the organization running the scheme was using legitimate logistics infrastructure to move something they couldn't move through normal channels. That matches what we saw last night, Thais said, reading over my shoulder. The substituted boxes, the multiple exchange points, the use of warehouse facilities that appear legitimate on paper. Exactly, the ASAC agreed, which suggests this CI might have access to information we need. The question is whether we can trust him, whether his information is genuine, or whether he's part of the misdirection, feeding us intelligence designed to lead us away from actual operations. How do we determine that? I asked. Carefully, the ASAC replied. I want you two to make contact with the CI. Meet him, assess his credibility, determine what he actually knows and what he's willing to share. But you do it completely off-book. No official documentation, no case file entries, nothing that could leak if our investigation is compromised. Use personal phones, meet in public locations, pay cash for everything. Treat this like you're operating in a hostile foreign country where you can't trust local infrastructure. The weight of what she was asking settled over me. Operating outside official channels meant operating without backup, without the safety net of bureau resources and protocols. It meant if something went wrong, we'd be on our own. But it also meant we'd be invisible to anyone monitoring official FBI activities, invisible to whoever might be leaking information. When do we make contact? Thais asked. Today, the ASAC said. The CI works a shift at a cargo handling facility in the Calumet Industrial Corridor. He gets off at 1500 hours. I'll send you the contact protocol on a burner phone. Pick one up from the equipment room, use it exclusively for this operation, and destroy it when you're done. She paused, her expression hardening. And listen to me carefully. If this CI is legitimate, if he has the information he claims, then he's in danger. These people have already demonstrated they're willing to kill to protect their operations. They won't hesitate to eliminate a threat, especially one that comes from inside their own organization. You think they've identified him as a potential informant? I asked. I think we have to assume they're looking for leaks just like we are, the ASAC replied. They're smart, organized, paranoid. If they suspect someone is talking to the FBI, they'll act. Which means you need to be extremely careful about how you approach this. One wrong move, one surveillance mistake, and you could get this person killed. The morning sun coming through the window seemed too bright suddenly, too cheerful for the conversation we were having. I thought about the 7 people we'd watched at the warehouse, about encrypted communications and coordinated operations, about an organization sophisticated enough to outmaneuver federal surveillance. Thought about what such an organization would do to someone who betrayed them. Understood, I said, closing the CI folder and standing. We'll make contact this afternoon, assess the situation, report back. No, the ASAC corrected. You'll assess the situation and make your own decisions about how to proceed. I don't want reports, don't want updates unless absolutely necessary. The less I know about your specific activities, the less I can inadvertently compromise if there is a leak. Use your training, trust your instincts, and keep each other safe. That's the priority, not the case, not the investigation. Keeping our people alive. It was a strange kind of authorization, permission to operate independently wrapped in warnings about dangers we couldn't fully see. But it was also a measure of the ASAC's trust, her belief that we could navigate this situation better on our own than we could following official protocols that might be compromised. Thais and I left the office together. neither of us speaking until we were in the elevator heading down to the equipment room. The doors closed, sealing us in the small metal box, and she finally said what we were both thinking. "This is bad, Alaric. Really bad." "I know," I replied. "If there's a leak, if someone's been feeding them our operational plans." She trailed off, but I understood. A leak meant betrayal, meant someone we knew had chosen money or ideology or fear over their oath, over their colleagues. It meant the investigation was tainted, possibly beyond recovery. "Let's focus on what we can control," I said. "The CI meeting, the intelligence gathering. We get information, we verify it independently. We build a case that doesn't rely on anything that might be compromised. Starting from scratch," Thais said. "After 9 months of work. If that's what it takes." The elevator reached the equipment room level and the doors opened onto a concrete hallway that smelled like gun oil and metal. We walked in silence to the equipment cage where a bored-looking agent sat behind a wire mesh window, barely glancing up as we approached. "Need a burner phone," I said, showing my credentials. "Clean, no case association." The agent disappeared into the back and returned a moment later with a basic flip phone in a sealed plastic bag. "Sign here," he said, pushing a clipboard through the window slot. I signed, accepted the phone, and we left without further conversation. Back in the elevator, Thais checked her watch. "We've got 5 hours before the CI gets off shift. What do you want to do until then?" "Research," I replied. "I want to look at every piece of intelligence we've gathered on this case, every surveillance report, every wiretap transcript. If there's a pattern to when operations went wrong, when our targets seemed to know we were watching, maybe we can identify the leak point. That's going to mean reading through thousands of pages of documentation. Then we'd better get started." We spent the next 4 hours in a windowless conference room, surrounded by file boxes and laptop screens, reviewing 9 months of investigative work with fresh and suspicious eyes. Every operation that had failed to yield results, every surveillance that had come up empty, every warrant that had found nothing, we documented it all, looking for commonalities, for the thread that might connect seemingly random failures into a pattern of deliberate compromise. Thais found it first, around hour 3, when her eyes were starting to glaze over and we were both surviving on vending machine coffee that tasted like despair. "Alaric," she said quietly, her finger tracing a line across a spreadsheet on her laptop screen. "Look at this." I moved to stand behind her, looking at what she'd discovered. It was a timeline, cross-referencing our operational activities with the case file access logs that tracked every time someone opened or modified investigation documents. The pattern was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't specifically looking for it. But once you saw it, it was unmistakable. Every time we'd planned a surveillance operation, every time we'd filed for a Title III intercept, every time we'd prepared to execute a search warrant, within 24 hours of that activity being documented in the case file, someone accessed those same documents. Not unusual on its own. Lots of people had legitimate reasons to review case files. But this wasn't lots of people. It was the same person, accessing the same types of documents, following a pattern that aligned almost perfectly with our operational failures. "Who is it?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Thais clicked through to the user identification logs, her hand shaking slightly as she navigated the database. The name that appeared made my blood run cold, made the room feel smaller and the air harder to breathe. It was someone we knew, someone we'd worked with, someone who had access to everything, who'd been part of this investigation from the beginning, who we'd trusted completely. "We need to tell the ASAC," Thais said, her voice barely above a whisper. "No," I replied, my mind racing through implications. Not yet. This could be a mistake, could be explained by legitimate case review. We need more evidence before we make an accusation like this. Alaric, if this person has been leaking, then they're careful, I interrupted. Careful enough to operate for 9 months without being caught, which means they'll have contingencies, explanations, ways to redirect suspicion. We go to the ASAC with just this, they'll lawyer up. The whole thing will collapse into internal investigations and administrative proceedings while the actual criminals walk free. So, what do you suggest? I checked my watch. We keep the CI meeting as planned. We gather new intelligence that this person hasn't seen, hasn't had access to. We build a separate case, something they can't compromise because they don't know it exists. And then, when we have enough, we bring it all down at once. The leak and the organization they've been protecting. Thais stared at the name on the screen for a long moment, then nodded slowly. All right, but Alaric, we don't trust anyone else. No one gets brought into this. No one gets told what we know. Just you and me. And Mercer, I added. We need his technical capabilities. Can we trust him? I thought about it, reviewed the access logs in my mind, considered the timing of events. He hasn't accessed the case files, I said. His name doesn't appear in any of the suspicious activity, and he's only been on this investigation for 2 weeks, too new to be the leak source. All right, Thais agreed reluctantly. The 3 of us. No one else. We left the conference room at 14:30 hours, giving ourselves plenty of time to reach the Calumet Industrial Corridor before the CI's shift ended. The drive south took us through neighborhoods that transitioned from commercial downtown to residential blocks to industrial wasteland. The city's economic geography laid out in stark visual terms. By the time we reached the cargo facility where the CI worked, we'd passed through 3 different versions of Chicago, 3 different realities existing side by side. The facility was enormous. Acres of concrete and steel, shipping containers stacked like building blocks, cranes moving overhead like mechanical dinosaurs. We parked in a public lot across the street, far enough away to avoid suspicion but close enough to observe the main employee entrance. According to the contact protocol the ASAC had sent to the burner phone, the CI would exit through that entrance at 1500 hours, walk to a bus stop 2 blocks east, and wait for contact there. What's our approach? Thais asked, watching workers in hard hats and safety vests move between buildings. Simple and direct, I replied. No games, no complicated spycraft. We walk up, identify ourselves, ask if he's willing to talk. If he says yes, we find somewhere private. If he says no, we walk away and try again another time. And if we're being watched, if someone from the organization is monitoring him, then we'll know pretty quickly, I said grimly. The question is what we do about it. We didn't have to wait long for an answer. At 14:58 hours, workers started streaming out of the facility's main entrance, the day shift ending. People heading home to families and dinner and normal lives unconnected to organized crime and federal investigations. We watched them emerge in groups of 2 and 3. Watched them disperse to parking lots and bus stops. Watched for anyone who might be conducting surveillance the same way we were. That's when I saw him. Or rather, when I saw the behavior pattern that suggested surveillance. A man in a sedan parked 3 spaces down from us, sitting too still, watching the facility entrance through a side mirror instead of looking directly. Professional observation technique. The kind taught to law enforcement and intelligence operatives, the kind that required training and practice. Thais, I said quietly. Gray sedan, 3 o'clock, 1 occupant. Watch his sightlines. She shifted position to get a better angle without being obvious about it. Got him, she confirmed after a moment. He's definitely watching the entrance. Think he's looking for the same person we are? Only one way to find out. At 15:03 hours, a man matching the CI's description emerged from the facility. Late 30s, medium build, wearing the same company uniform as the other workers but carrying a small backpack that seemed out of place. He walked with purpose toward the bus stop, not looking around, not showing any signs of surveillance awareness. Either he didn't know he was being watched, or he was very good at pretending not to know. The man in the gray sedan noticed him too. I watched as he made a phone call, spoke briefly, then started his engine. He didn't follow the CI directly. That would have been too obvious. But he pulled out of the lot and drove slowly in the same direction, maintaining visual contact without closing distance. Decision time, Thais said. Do we make contact with the CI while he's under surveillance, or do we follow the surveillance and see where it leads? It was the same impossible choice we'd faced the night before. Which target to follow, which opportunity to pursue, knowing that choosing one meant losing the other. But this time, the stakes felt more immediate, more personal. The CI was exposed, vulnerable, possibly unaware that the organization he'd informed on was watching him. If we didn't intervene, if we let him walk into whatever trap might be waiting, we split up, I decided. You make contact with the CI, get him somewhere safe, find out what he knows. I'll follow the surveillance vehicle, see who's running it and where it leads. We stay in contact via the burner phones, coordinate if the situations converge. Alaric, that's the only option, I interrupted. We can't protect him and gather intelligence at the same time with just 2 agents. This way, we accomplish both objectives. Thais didn't look happy about it, but she nodded. Stay safe, she said, already opening her door. And if this goes bad, if you need backup, I'll call, I assured her. Now go. He's already at the bus stop. She exited the vehicle and walked across the street with purposeful casualness. Just another pedestrian in an industrial neighborhood. I watched her approach the CI, saw them exchange a few words, saw his body language shift from casual to alert when she showed him her credentials. Then I shifted my attention back to the gray sedan, which had pulled into a loading zone half a block from the bus stop, maintaining observation. The CI and Thais walked away together, heading east toward a commercial area where they could disappear into storefronts and coffee shops. The gray sedan's driver watched them go, made another phone call, and slowly pulled back into traffic and began following at a distance. I waited a few seconds, then pulled out behind him, maintaining the same careful separation he was using with Thais and the CI. We were a chain now, the CI being followed by Thais being followed by the gray sedan being followed by me. Each link aware of the one ahead, but not the one behind. Each pursuing their own objectives while being pursued in turn. The gray sedan drove carefully, professionally, through the industrial corridor toward the more populated areas to the north. Whoever was driving had training, experience with mobile surveillance. They varied their speed, used turn signals, maintained consistent following distance. All the techniques designed to avoid detection while keeping a target in sight. My burner phone buzzed with a text from Thais. CI secure, getting his story now. Where are you? I typed back with one hand while steering with the other. Following your tail. Gray sedan, professional operator, stay alert. The response came quickly. Understood. CI says the organization knows someone talked to FBI. Looking for the leak. My chest tightened. If they were actively searching for informants, if they'd identified the CI as a security threat, then this surveillance wasn't just observation. It was preparation for elimination. The gray sedan wasn't following to gather intelligence. It was following to find the right moment, the right location, to permanently solve their informant problem. I called Thais, keeping my voice low. "Get him out of sight immediately. This isn't surveillance, it's target acquisition. They're looking for an opportunity." "Where do we go?" she asked, and I could hear the tension in her voice. "Somewhere public, lots of witnesses, security cameras. A shopping mall maybe, or police station if there's one nearby. Somewhere they can't act without being observed." "There's a shopping center 4 blocks north," she replied. "We're heading there now." "Good. I'll maintain pursuit on the tail, try to identify the operator. But Thais? If they make a move, if you see any indication they're preparing to act, you call for backup immediately. Protocol be damned. We get uniform units there and we protect the CI. Understood?" "Understood," she confirmed, and disconnected. The gray sedan continued following Thais and the CI north, making the same turns they made, matching their pace. We were approaching a more populated area now, strip malls and gas stations, the transition zone between industrial wasteland and commercial development. More traffic, more witnesses, more complications for everyone involved. Then the gray sedan's driver made a phone call, spoke briefly, and suddenly changed course, turning east instead of continuing north, breaking off surveillance and accelerating away from Thais and the CI. It happened so quickly I almost missed it, almost followed Thais instead of the sedan, but something in my training kicked in and I made the decision to stay with the surveillance vehicle. Because if they'd broken off pursuit, it wasn't because they'd lost interest. It was because someone else was taking over, or because they'd decided on a different approach. Either way, understanding their movements was critical to keeping the CI safe. I followed the gray sedan east into neighborhoods I didn't know well, past bodegas and walk-up apartments, through areas where federal agents stood out like spotlights. The sedan made several turns, clearly checking for pursuit now, and I had to drop back further to avoid detection. At one point, I thought I'd lost them entirely, then spotted the vehicle parked outside a small grocery store on a corner lot. I drove past without slowing, found a parking spot 2 blocks away and approached on foot. The gray sedan was still there, engine running, driver still inside, waiting for something, or someone. My phone buzzed. Shopping center secured. CI talking. Getting good intel. Your status. Surveillance vehicle stopped at corner grocery, 87th and Ashland. I texted back. Driver waiting in vehicle. Possible meeting point. Be careful. I moved closer, using parked cars and building corners for cover, getting an angle where I could see the sedan's driver clearly. Male, 40s, professional appearance, talking on his phone with the kind of animated gestures that suggested frustration or argument. After a minute, he ended the call and sat there, fingers drumming on the steering wheel, clearly agitated. Then a second vehicle pulled up, a black SUV with tinted windows parking directly beside the gray sedan. The sedan's driver exited and approached the SUV, leaning down to speak to whoever was inside. I couldn't hear the conversation from my position, but their body language suggested disagreement, possibly anger. The conversation lasted maybe 90 seconds. Then the sedan driver returned to his vehicle and both vehicles departed. The SUV heading north, the sedan heading south. They were splitting up, going different directions, making it impossible for me to follow both. I chose the SUV. It was larger, more expensive, suggested someone higher in the organization's hierarchy. I jogged back to my car and pulled into traffic, searching for the black vehicle in the late afternoon congestion. Caught sight of it 3 blocks ahead, took several risks with traffic laws to close the distance, settled into pursuit mode. The SUV drove north and then west, looping back toward the industrial areas we'd left earlier, moving with purpose now instead of the careful surveillance pace. We passed the cargo facility where the CI had worked, continued west into the Calumet corridor's deeper industrial zones, areas dominated by warehouses and freight terminals and chemical plants. My phone rang. Thais calling. "The CI just told me something important," she said without preamble. "The organization has a scheduled exchange tonight. Major one, involving multiple vehicles and at least 3 different locations. He doesn't have all the details, but he knows the primary drop point, a warehouse on the west side, near the Stevenson Expressway." "What time?" I asked, watching the SUV turn into an industrial park. 2200 hours. And Alaric? He says this is different from their normal operations. Whatever they're moving tonight, it's big enough that they've canceled their usual security protocols, consolidated resources. He thinks they're exposed, vulnerable, but only if we hit them at exactly the right moment. "Or it's a trap," I suggested. "They know we're investigating. They might know about the CI. They could be setting up an operation specifically to draw us in." "That's possible," Thais admitted. "But the CI seems genuine. I've been doing this long enough to read people, and I think he's telling the truth." I thought about the SUV ahead of me, about the surveillance we'd observed, about 9 months of investigation that had been systematically compromised. Thought about the name in the access logs, about the leak that had allowed our targets to stay ahead of us at every turn. "Here's what we do," I said, making the decision even as I spoke it. "You stay with the CI, get every piece of information he has about tonight's operation. Locations, timing, personnel, everything. I'm following what I think might be a high-value target from the organization. If I can identify who's running this operation, if we can connect them to the criminal activity directly, then we have something that bypasses the compromised investigation. What about the ASAC? Don't we need to report this?" "Not yet," I replied. "Not until we know the scope of what we're dealing with. If we report now, if the information goes into official channels, it might leak. The operation tonight might get canceled, the CI might get exposed, everything could collapse. So we're operating completely alone," Thais said quietly. "No backup, no official authorization, no safety net." "Just like the ASAC told us to," I confirmed. "Trust our training, trust our instincts, keep each other safe. Can you handle the CI on your own?" "Yeah," she replied, though I could hear the uncertainty in her voice. "But Alaric, promise me you won't do anything stupid. If that SUV leads somewhere dangerous, if you see something that requires backup, you call it in. Don't try to be a hero." "Same to you," I said. "The CI is your responsibility now. Whatever he tells you, wherever he leads you, you keep him alive and you get that intelligence. That's the priority." "Understood. Stay in touch." The call ended and I was alone again, following the black SUV deeper into the industrial corridor, into areas where legitimate business gave way to abandoned facilities and empty lots. The sun was getting lower now, shadows lengthening, the transition from afternoon to evening making visibility more difficult. The SUV turned into the parking lot of what looked like an abandoned factory, 3-story brick building, most windows broken or boarded up, loading docks sealed with rusted metal. It pulled around to the back of the building, out of sight from the street. I drove past without slowing, circled the block, parked in a lot serving a different building 2 blocks away. I approached on foot, moving between buildings and using long shadows for cover, getting close enough to observe without being seen. The SUV was parked beside a rear entrance to the factory, and 3 people had emerged, the driver and 2 passengers. They stood talking for a moment. Then one of them unlocked a heavy steel door and all 3 entered the building. This was it, I realized. Whatever this location was, meeting point, operational hub, storage facility, it was important enough to warrant a personal visit from people who clearly held significant positions in the organization. This was the opportunity we needed, the chance to gather intelligence that could break the case open. The smart thing would be to maintain external observation, document who came and went, identify vehicles and personnel. The safe thing would be to call Thais, coordinate our activities, maybe even risk bringing in the ASAC for official support. But something in my gut told me that waiting, that following protocols, would mean missing the opportunity. Whatever was happening inside that factory, whatever these people were planning for tonight's operation, the answers were behind that steel door. I checked my service weapon, ensured my phone was on silent, took a deep breath. Then I moved toward the factory, toward answers, toward a decision point I knew I might regret but couldn't avoid. The steel door they'd entered through was slightly ajar, an oversight maybe, or intentional for quick exit. I pulled it open slowly, listening for sounds from inside, checking sightlines before committing to entry. The interior was dark, lit only by dim emergency lighting and whatever sunlight penetrated the broken windows above. I could make out the shapes of old manufacturing equipment, conveyor systems long since stilled, workstations gathering dust. The building smelled like oil and rust and decay, the scent of industry abandoned. Voices echoed from somewhere above me. The second or third floor, impossible to tell with the way sound bounced off concrete and metal. I moved toward a stairwell in the corner of the main floor, each step careful and deliberate, every sense alert for signs of danger. The stairs were metal, corroded but still solid, leading up into deeper darkness. I climbed slowly, testing each step before committing my weight, trying to minimize noise. At the second floor landing, the voices became clearer, 3 distinct speakers, words still indistinct but tone suggesting argument or intense discussion. I continued up to the third floor, emerged into a long corridor with offices on either side, most doors open or missing entirely. The voices came from the far end of the corridor, from what looked like a larger room, maybe a former management office or conference space. Light spilled from that room, electric light, suggesting they'd brought portable lighting or the building had partial power. I moved down the corridor, using the doorways for cover, getting close enough to hear words instead of just voices. "Can't proceed if there's FBI surveillance," one voice was saying. Male, older, authoritative. "We've invested too much to have it fall apart now." "The surveillance was last night," a second voice replied. Younger, defensive. "We misdirected them. They followed the decoys like we planned. There's been no indication they're on to the real operation." "But they're still investigating," the first voice countered. "They're still watching, still gathering intelligence. And now we have potential informant problems. Someone's been talking, someone with access to operational details." "We're handling it," a third voice interjected. Female this time, cold and precise. "The informant will be identified and dealt with. The FBI's investigation will be managed through our internal channels. Tonight's operation can proceed as planned." I pressed myself against the wall outside the room, processing what I'd heard. They knew about the CI, knew someone had been talking to the FBI. They had internal channels for managing the investigation, which could only mean the leak we'd identified, the person who'd been accessing case files and compromising operations. "What about the shipment?" the first voice asked. "Any problems with the logistics?" "Everything's in place," the female voice replied. "The primary vehicle will arrive at the Stevenson location at 2200 hours. The product will be transferred to 3 separate vehicles for distribution. We'll use the same protocol as last night. Staged exchanges, decoy routes, encrypted communications. Even if FBI maintains surveillance, they won't be able to track all the endpoints." I pulled out my phone, started an audio recording app, held it near the doorway to capture the conversation. This was evidence potentially admissible, if I could establish proper chain of custody, if I could explain how I'd obtained it without violating protocol so severely that a judge would suppress it. "And the buyer?" the first voice asked. "They're confident about the timeline?" "They're ready," the female voice confirmed. "Payment has been arranged through the usual channels. This is the largest single transaction we've attempted. If it succeeds, if we can demonstrate the capacity to move this volume without detection, it opens up significantly larger opportunities." "Then we can't afford mistakes," the first voice said. "No exposure, no FBI interference, no loose ends. Whatever it takes to ensure success, we do it. Understood?" "Understood," the other voices echoed. I heard movement in the room, chairs scraping, footsteps, the sounds of a meeting concluding. They were about to leave, which meant I needed to leave first, get out before they discovered me. I backed away from the doorway, moved quickly but quietly back down the corridor toward the stairs. That's when my foot caught on something, a piece of debris, a crack in the floor, impossible to see in the darkness. I stumbled, caught myself against the wall with a metallic clang that echoed down the corridor like a gunshot. The voices in the room stopped immediately. "What was that?" someone asked. I ran, abandoning stealth for speed, hitting the stairwell and descending as quickly as I dared. Behind me, I heard doors opening, shouts, the sound of pursuit. They'd discovered me, knew someone had been listening, were coming. I reached the ground floor and ran for the steel door I'd entered through, burst out into the late afternoon light, heard voices behind me getting closer. Made it to the corner of the building when a vehicle rounded from the front. Another SUV, black, blocking my path to the parking lot where I'd left my car. The driver emerged, reaching for something in his jacket. I didn't wait to see what it was. I turned and ran the other direction, into the maze of industrial buildings and empty lots, into territory I didn't know while being chased by people who probably did. My phone was in my hand. I dialed Thais while running, gasping into the phone when she answered. "Compromised. They made me, multiple pursuers, industrial area near 39th and Pulaski, need extraction." The call cut off as I rounded a corner and came face to face with a chain-link fence, 8 feet high, topped with barbed wire. Behind me, footsteps and voices getting closer. No time to climb, nowhere to go except through a narrow gap between buildings to my right. I squeezed through, emerged into a loading area behind another factory, saw an open bay door and ran for it. Into darkness again, into a building that might offer hiding places or might trap me, but it was the only option available. The interior was vast, another abandoned factory floor, more old equipment, more shadows. I found a position behind a large industrial press, crouched there trying to control my breathing, listening for pursuit. They entered the building. I could hear them fanning out, searching systematically. "Whoever it is, they're still here," a voice called. "Find them." I looked at my phone. Thais had called back 4 times, left text messages I didn't dare open because the screen light would give away my position. I powered it down completely, eliminated that risk. The searchers were getting closer, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. I needed a way out, but every exit I could see had someone near it. I was trapped, cornered, and if they found me, if they realized I was FBI, if they understood how much I'd heard, I had no illusions about what would happen next. Then I saw it, a floor grate near my position, probably covering access to maintenance tunnels or utility corridors. I quietly pulled it open, looked down into darkness that might lead nowhere or might lead to freedom. No choice, really. I lowered myself into the gap, pulled the grate closed above me, descended into the unknown. The tunnel was narrow, concrete, pitch black. I felt my way forward blindly, moving by touch, hoping it led somewhere useful instead of just deeper into the building's infrastructure. Water dripped somewhere ahead, and I could smell mold and rust. Above me, muffled by concrete, I heard the searchers continue their pattern. Someone passed directly over my position. I could see flashlight beams through the grate, hear their frustrated voices discussing where I might have gone. I continued forward in the darkness, hands against the tunnel walls, feet feeling for obstacles. After what felt like hours, but was probably minutes, I saw light ahead. Dim, distant, but definitely light. I moved toward it, emerged into a larger space, a junction where multiple tunnels met, and found myself face to face with someone who'd been waiting there, who'd predicted where I'd emerge, who raised a weapon and said quietly, "FBI, don't move." But it wasn't one of them. It was Mercer, holding his service weapon, lowering it when he recognized me. "Jesus, Alaric," he breathed. "Thais called me, said you were in trouble. I've been tracking your phone's last location, found the tunnel system on building schematics." "How did you know I'd come this way?" I asked, still trying to process his appearance. "I didn't," he admitted. "I've been checking every exit point. You're the lucky one. There are 3 other tunnels I haven't reached yet." He paused. "Come on, we need to move. Thais is maintaining observation above ground, says there are at least 6 hostiles searching the area." We moved through the tunnels together, Mercer navigating using blueprints on his phone, leading us away from the factory toward an exit point 3 buildings away. We emerged in a storm drain, climbed up to street level in an alley, found Mercer's van parked nearby. "Get in," he said, and I didn't argue. Only when we were blocks away, when my heart rate finally started returning to normal, did I realize what I'd almost lost: the recording. I powered on my phone, found the audio file still there, still intact. 15 minutes of conversation, names and details and admissions of criminal activity. "What did you get?" Mercer asked, glancing over while driving. "Everything," I replied, listening to the recording to confirm it was usable. "Location for tonight's operation, confirmation of the leak, evidence of criminal conspiracy, everything we need to bring this down." My phone showed 17 missed calls from Thais, 6 voicemails, countless texts. I called her back. "Where are you?" She answered immediately, her voice tight with stress. "Are you safe?" "I'm with Mercer," I replied. "I'm safe, but we have a problem. They know someone was listening. They'll be on high alert now. We need to move quickly before they change their plans." "The CI is still with me," she said. "He's given me details about tonight. 3 different distribution points, at least 10 vehicles involved, estimated contraband value in the millions. If we can intercept even one of the transfers, if we can make arrests and seize evidence before the leak compromises it, we might be able to salvage this investigation." I thought about the recording in my phone, about the evidence we'd gathered, about 9 months of work coming down to one operation tonight. Thought about the leak who could destroy everything if they learned our plans, about the organization that had stayed ahead of us at every turn. Then we don't tell anyone, I decided. No official channels, no case files, no notifications to the ASAC. We 3, you, me, Mercer, were the only ones who know the full plan. We hit them tonight hard and fast before they realize what's happening. "That's incredibly risky," Thais warned. "If something goes wrong, if we need backup, then we call it in when we need it," I interrupted. "But until then, we operate dark. It's the only way to ensure the leak doesn't compromise this final operation." Silence on the line, then. "All right, where do we meet?" "Somewhere secure, somewhere we can plan without being observed." I thought for a moment. "There's a 24-hour diner on Roosevelt Road, near the interstate. Public enough that we won't stand out, isolated enough that we can talk, Meet us there in 1 hour. What about the CI? Bring him, I said. If tonight goes bad, if this operation fails, he's our only asset left. We need to keep him close. The call ended. I looked at Mercer, saw him processing everything he'd heard. You're in, I told him. This is off book, possibly career ending if it goes wrong. Last chance to walk away. He didn't hesitate. I'm in. These people have been making us look like fools for months. Time to turn the tables. We drove through the evening traffic toward the diner, toward a meeting that would determine the outcome of 9 months of investigation, toward decisions that would either vindicate our methods or destroy our careers. The sun was setting over Chicago, painting the sky in shades of orange and red, beautiful and indifferent to the small dramas playing out below. Somewhere in the city, an organization was preparing for a major operation, confident in their ability to evade detection, protected by a leak they thought gave them immunity from consequences. But they didn't know what we knew. They didn't know we'd identified the leak, that we were operating outside compromised channels, that we'd gathered evidence they didn't know existed. Tonight, the tables would turn. Tonight, we'd show them that being smart wasn't enough, that staying ahead wasn't the same as being untouchable. Tonight, in the darkness of Lower Wacker, or the industrial corridors of the South Side, or wherever their operation led us, we'd be waiting. The diner smelled like burnt coffee and fryer grease. The kind of place where the waitress called everyone Han, and nobody asked questions about strangers meeting in corner booths. We'd chosen a table in the back, away from windows, with clear sight lines to both exits. The CI sat across from me, nursing a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, his hands shaking slightly every time a customer entered. His name, or at least the name he'd given us, was irrelevant to the operation, so we simply called him the Source when we needed to reference him at all. He was 42, worked cargo handling for 16 years, and looked like those 16 years had been harder than they should have been. Thais sat beside him, reviewing notes on her personal tablet. Nothing connected to bureau systems. Nothing that could be traced or monitored. Mercer was at the counter, ostensibly ordering food, but actually positioned where he could watch the parking lot and street beyond. We looked like any other group of people grabbing a late dinner. Nothing remarkable, nothing worth remembering. That was the point. Tell us again about the Stevenson location, I said quietly, keeping my voice low enough that it wouldn't carry to neighboring booths. Every detail you can remember. The Source took a breath, steadying himself. It's a warehouse complex off Kedzie Avenue, maybe 2 blocks south of the expressway. The building they use is the third one from the east entrance. Red brick, 3 loading docks. Looks abandoned, but the company owns it through one of their shell corporations. They've been using it for about 8 months, always for the bigger operations. What makes this operation bigger? Thais asked, not looking up from her tablet. The volume, he replied. Usually they move maybe 20-30 units per exchange. Tonight they're talking about 300, maybe more. It's the biggest single transfer I've heard them discuss, and they're nervous about it. That's why they changed protocols, consolidated operations instead of spreading them out. I thought about the conversation I'd recorded in the factory, about the organization's confidence that they could move high volume without detection. What exactly are the units? What's being transferred? The Source hesitated, glanced around the diner despite knowing we were as isolated as we could be. I don't know specifics. I handle manifests, shipping documentation, but the actual contents, that's kept compartmentalized. I know it comes in from overseas, gets processed through the port facility, then moves through legitimate logistics channels until it reaches Chicago. After that, it disappears into their distribution network. But you've seen the containers, I pressed. You must have some idea. They're small, he said. Maybe the size of a shoebox, sealed in plastic, marked with codes I don't understand. Heavy, though. Heavier than you'd expect for their size. And they're careful with them, real careful. Temperature-controlled transport, specific handling protocols, armed security at every transfer point. Mercer had returned from the counter, sliding into the booth beside me. That suggests high-value contraband, he observed. Pharmaceuticals, maybe, or processed narcotics. Something that requires specific environmental conditions and justifies extensive security measures. Could be technology, Thais suggested. Computer components, industrial equipment, things subject to export restrictions. That would explain the overseas origin and the need for circumventing normal channels. Whatever it is, it's worth killing for, the source said quietly. I've seen what they do to people who cause problems. Last year, one of the warehouse supervisors noticed irregularities in the shipping manifests, started asking questions. They found him in his car 2 weeks later. A single gunshot to the head, made to look like suicide. Police closed the case in 48 hours, didn't even investigate properly. I exchanged glances with Thais. A potential homicide covered up, possibly with help from inside the police department. That suggested the organization's reach extended beyond criminal enterprise into institutional corruption, which explained how they'd maintained operations for so long without significant law enforcement interference. Did you report the supervisor's death to anyone? I asked. Who would I report it to? The source replied, his voice carrying an edge of bitterness. For all I know, the people who killed him are the same ones who would take my report. That's why I came to the FBI, federal jurisdiction, outside the local systems that might be compromised. Smart, Mercer said. But it also means we can't rely on local law enforcement for backup tonight. If there are officers on the organization's payroll, calling for assistance could tip them off. So we're truly alone, Thais said, the reality of our situation settling over the table like fog. 3 agents against an organization with unlimited resources, inside help, and no hesitation about using violence. 3 agents with one significant advantage, I corrected, pulling out my phone and setting it on the table. They don't know we're coming. They think their leak has given them complete visibility into our operations, but tonight, this exists outside their awareness. We're not in case files, not in official communications. As far as they know, the FBI is still chasing shadows while they run their operation unopposed. I played a portion of the recorded conversation from the factory, keeping the volume low but letting them hear the evidence we'd gathered. The source's eyes widened as he listened, recognizing voices, understanding implications. When the recording finished, he sat back in the booth, processing what he'd heard. That's the operations director, he said, pointing at the phone. The first male voice. That's the person who coordinates all the major transfers. And the woman, she's from the legal side, handles the documentation and cover operations. If you have them on tape discussing the criminal activity, if you can connect them to tonight's transfer, we can dismantle the entire operation. Thais finished. Cut the head off the snake. Assuming we can intercept the transfer without getting killed, Mercer added pragmatically. They'll have security, probably armed. We're 3 agents with sidearms against unknown numbers with unknown capabilities. Then we don't confront them directly, I said, the plan forming as I spoke it. We document everything, gather evidence, identify personnel, track the distribution endpoints. Then we call in tactical support for the arrests, FBI hostage rescue team, Chicago SWAT, whoever we can get on short notice. But we only make that call when we have everything we need, when there's no possibility of the leak compromising the operation. That gives us maybe a 2-hour window, Thais calculated. from initial observation at 2200 hours to the point where tactical teams can be mobilized and positioned. During that time, we're exposed, vulnerable, operating without backup in a potentially hostile environment. I know, I acknowledged, but it's the only way. If we bring people in too early, if we follow official protocols, the leak will know. The operation will get canceled, the evidence will disappear, and we'll have nothing. The source leaned forward, his fear evident, but his voice steady. What do you need from me? Everything you know about tonight, I replied. The Stevenson location is the primary transfer point, but you mentioned 3 distribution endpoints. Where are they? He pulled out his own phone, an old model, probably a burner, and opened a notes app with information he'd apparently been collecting. One endpoint is in the West Loop, near the old meatpacking district. Another's on the north side, somewhere around Uptown. I don't have the exact address. The third is back in the Calumet area, probably near the port where the shipments originate. So they're creating a distribution triangle, Mercer observed. Primary transfer at Stevenson, then the product moves to 3 different sectors of the city for final distribution to end users. Classic compartmentalization. If one endpoint gets compromised, the others remain operational. Can you identify the vehicles? Thais asked the source. Makes, models, plate numbers? Not all of them, he admitted. They rotate vehicles, use rentals and stolen plates, but the primary transport, the one bringing the product to Stevenson, that's usually a white commercial van, unmarked, with legitimate DOT numbers. Looks completely normal, passes any casual inspection. I made notes, building a mental picture of the operation. Timing? You said 2200 hours for the Stevenson transfer, but what about the distribution endpoints? The secondary transfers happen quickly, the source explained. Maybe 15, 20 minutes after the primary. They want to minimize exposure, get the product distributed and moving before anyone can respond. By 2230, 2245 hours, everything will be scattered across the city. Basically, impossible to track unless you know exactly where to look. Which means we need eyes on all 3 distribution points simultaneously, I said. Otherwise, we catch one endpoint and lose the other 2. That's impossible with 3 people, Mercer pointed out. We can't maintain effective surveillance on 3 separate locations while also documenting the primary transfer. Then we prioritize, I decided. We focus on Stevenson, document the primary transfer, identify as many participants as possible. Then we pick one distribution endpoint, the one most likely to yield arrests and evidence, and we follow the product there. We can't save everything, but we can save enough to make the case. Thais was quiet for a moment, then said, the West Loop endpoint. If they're using the old meatpacking district, there are limited access routes, lots of industrial buildings that create natural choke points. If we're going to attempt interdiction, that's our best tactical option. Agreed, Mercer said. Plus, it's closer to downtown. Easier to get tactical support there quickly when we make the call. The source was watching us plan with something between hope and terror on his face. What happens to me? He asked quietly. After tonight, whether this works or not, they're going to know someone talked. They'll figure out it was me. The question hung there, unanswered for a long moment. The truth was, we couldn't protect him indefinitely. Witness protection required official channels, paperwork, bureaucratic processes that would take days or weeks. And if the organization had reach into law enforcement agencies, if they had the resources to hunt for informants systematically, then nowhere in Chicago would be safe for him. We'll get you out, I said, finally, knowing it was an incomplete answer, but the only one I could offer. Tonight, after the operation concludes, we'll arrange transport out of the city. New identity, new location, whatever it takes. But right now, your safety depends on this operation succeeding. If we can arrest the leadership, dismantle the organization, then the threat to you diminishes significantly." He nodded slowly, accepting the uncertainty because he had no other choice. "All right. What do you need me to do?" "Stay with Thais," I instructed. "She'll keep you secure during the operation. If things go wrong, if we need additional intelligence, or if the situation changes, you're our resource. Otherwise, you stay out of sight, stay safe, and wait for extraction." I looked at my watch. 8:47 p.m. We had a little over 3 hours before the operation began. 3 hours to finalize plans, position assets, prepare for every contingency we could imagine, and several we probably couldn't. "Mercer, what equipment do you have available?" I asked. "Full surveillance kit," he replied. "Directional microphones, infrared cameras, radio frequency scanners, recording equipment. I've got it all staged in my van, ready for deployment. Plus, I grabbed some additional gear from the equipment room: night vision optics, tactical vests, extra ammunition. Figured we might need it." "Body cameras?" Thais asked. 3 units, fully charged, with redundant storage. Everything we document tonight will be preserved in multiple formats, multiple locations. Chain of custody will be solid. "Communications," I pressed. "That's trickier," Mercer admitted. "We can't use bureau radios, too easy to monitor, too much risk of the leak intercepting our transmissions. I've got encrypted phones we can use, but the encryption is only as good as the discipline we maintain. No names, no specific details over the air, everything in code phrases. Work up a simple code system," I told him. "Nothing complicated, just enough to obscure our communications if someone's listening. Primary colors for locations, numbers for personnel counts, simple phrases for status updates." Mercer nodded, already pulling out a notepad to sketch the framework. While he worked on that, I turned to Thais. "Worst-case scenarios. Walk me through them." She didn't hesitate. We'd trained for this. The mental exercise of imagining failure and planning to survive it. Scenario 1. We're identified during initial surveillance. They make our position, either abort the operation or move to eliminate the threat. Response: we withdraw immediately, call for tactical support, attempt to salvage what intelligence we've gathered. Scenario 2, I continued. The transfer happens, but we lose visual contact during distribution. We can't track the product to the endpoints. Response: we focus on identifying participants at the primary transfer, Thais said. License plates, facial recognition if possible, anything that allows us to build target packages for future operations. We lose the product, but we gain the people. Scenario 3. We're compromised during the interdiction phase. They realize we're federal agents and they respond with force. This was the one that worried me most. The scenario where our small numbers and limited firepower became critical vulnerabilities. Thais' expression suggested she shared my concern. Response: we fall back to defensive positions, call for immediate backup, prioritize survival over evidence collection. We're no good to anyone dead. Scenario 4, Mercer interjected, without looking up from his code system notes. The leak learns about our operation before it begins. They warn the organization, everything gets canceled. Response: there isn't one, I admitted. If the leak knows, we're done. That's why this information stays completely compartmentalized. No communication with anyone outside this table. No official documentation. Nothing that could find its way back to compromised channels. We spent the next hour refining the plan, going over maps and timing and contingencies until everyone could execute their role without conscious thought. The source provided additional details about the warehouse layout, security measures he'd observed during previous operations, patterns of behavior that might help us anticipate the organization's actions. At 9:52 p.m., I called for the check and we prepared to leave. The waitress barely glanced at us as we paid in cash. Exact amount plus tip. Nothing memorable. Just another group of customers disappearing into the Chicago night. We walked to the parking lot where Mercer's surveillance van and my sedan waited. Thais would drive the source to a safe location, a hotel near O'Hare, paid for with cash, registered under a false name. She'd stay with him until the operation concluded, monitoring our communications, ready to extract us if things went wrong or coordinate tactical support if we succeeded. "Stay safe," she said to me, the words carrying more weight than their simplicity suggested. "You too," I replied. "And Thais, if you don't hear from us by midnight, if communications go dark and we don't respond, you make the call. Get tactical teams to Stevenson, get the ASAC involved. Don't worry about protecting the investigation. Just get people there." She nodded, understanding that I was giving her permission to break operational security if it meant the difference between our survival and our deaths. Then, she and the source were gone, their vehicle disappearing into traffic, leaving Mercer and me alone with 3 hours of waiting ahead. We drove to a position near the Stevenson warehouse complex, found a vantage point in an empty lot across Kedzie Avenue with clear sight lines to the target building. Mercer began setting up surveillance equipment while I studied the area through binoculars, noting security cameras, lighting conditions, potential approach routes, and escape paths. The warehouse looked exactly as the source had described. Red brick, 3 loading docks, the kind of building that had been constructed in an era when Chicago was an industrial powerhouse and had been decaying slowly ever since. 2 of the loading docks were sealed with rusted bay doors, but the third showed signs of recent use. Fresh tire marks in the concrete, the door mechanism apparently functional. "I'm picking up radio traffic," Mercer said, adjusting his equipment. "Encrypted, same frequency range as what we heard last night. Someone's already on site, running security checks or preparing for the transfer." "How many signals?" I asked. "At least 3, maybe 4. Hard to get an exact count with the encryption interfering with the signal isolation." So they had advanced security in place, people checking the location before the main operation began. Professional protocol. Exactly what I would have done if I were running an illegal transfer in a potentially hostile environment. It also meant our window for setting up surveillance was narrowing. If their security was thorough, they'd eventually expand their perimeter and might spot us. "Let's move closer," I decided. "Find a position inside their likely security zone, somewhere they've already cleared. They won't expect surveillance inside the perimeter they've established." It was a risk. Getting closer meant greater chance of detection, but also better intelligence gathering. Mercer looked uncertain, but nodded. Began packing the essential equipment into a portable case that could pass for a utility worker's toolkit. We approached the warehouse complex on foot, moving between buildings, using shadows and industrial debris for cover. The area was largely abandoned at this hour, a few security lights on neighboring buildings, the occasional vehicle passing on Kedzie Avenue, but otherwise silent and empty. I spotted the security personnel before they spotted us. 2 figures conducting a perimeter walk, checking sight lines and access points. They moved with military precision, suggesting training beyond normal criminal experience. Former law enforcement or military, I guessed. People who knew how to secure a location and what to look for. We held position behind a dumpster, waiting for them to complete their circuit and move to a different section of the perimeter. When they were clear, we advanced to a maintenance shed approximately 50 yards from the primary warehouse, a small structure that looked abandoned but offered concealment and a direct view of the loading dock. Mercer set up equipment quickly and efficiently, camera positioned in a crack in the shed's wall, directional microphone aimed at the loading dock, all recording to encrypted storage devices. I checked my watch, 10:27 p.m. We had 93 minutes until the scheduled transfer. The waiting began again, but this time it felt different, more immediate, more tense. We were committed now, inside their security perimeter, close enough to see faces and hear conversations, but also close enough to be discovered if we made any mistake. At 10:49 p.m., the first transfer vehicle arrived. A white commercial van, exactly as the source had described. It pulled into the warehouse complex, drove directly to the third loading dock, backed up to the bay door. Two people emerged from the warehouse to meet it, conducted a brief conversation with the driver, then all three disappeared inside. "Got clear images of all three subjects," Mercer whispered, reviewing his camera feed. "Running facial recognition now against bureau databases." Minutes passed. The facial recognition software was checking thousands of images, looking for matches in criminal databases, previous surveillance photos, any identification that would tell us who we were watching. "No hits," Mercer reported quietly. "Either they're clean, or they're using identities we haven't encountered before." "Mark them as unknown subjects for now," I instructed. "We'll identify them post-operation." At 11:03 p.m., activity increased significantly. 3 more vehicles arrived in quick succession: a black sedan, a silver SUV, and another commercial van, this one gray. People emerged from all 3 vehicles, maybe 8 or 9 individuals total, all moving with purpose toward the warehouse. "This is it," I said, feeling my pulse quicken. "The main operation. Start documenting everything." Mercer's cameras captured it all: faces, license plates, patterns of movement. The people entering the warehouse were dressed casually, nothing to distinguish them from ordinary citizens, but their coordination suggested this was a well-rehearsed operation. At 11:17 p.m., the loading dock door began to open, revealing the warehouse interior. Industrial lighting illuminated a space that had clearly been prepared for tonight. The floor was clear of debris. Several tables had been set up in a configuration that suggested staging areas, and I could see stacks of the small boxes the source had described, each one carefully sealed and marked with codes. "Jesus," Mercer breathed. "There must be 300 units, maybe more. If each one contains high-value contraband, it's millions of dollars worth of product," I finished. "Enough to justify the security, the planning, everything we've observed." The transfer began with methodical efficiency. People formed a chain, moving boxes from storage locations in the warehouse to the white van, loading them in careful configuration that maximized the space while ensuring safe transport. Others were checking manifests, making notes on tablets, coordinating the operation with the kind of precision you'd expect from a legitimate logistics company. I was recording video on my phone, in addition to Mercer's cameras, creating redundant documentation. Everything we captured tonight would need to withstand legal scrutiny, would need to prove beyond reasonable doubt that these people were engaged in criminal activity. At 11:34 p.m., someone emerged from the warehouse who made me catch my breath. Even from our distance, even in the inconsistent lighting, I recognized them, not from criminal databases or surveillance photos, but from the Chicago FBI field office. It was the leak, the person whose access logs had revealed their betrayal, now here in person coordinating with the very criminals they'd been protecting. "Mercer," I whispered urgently. "The subject who just emerged from the warehouse. Tell me you're getting clear images." "Affirmative," he confirmed. "Multiple angles, high resolution. Who is it?" "Later," I said, not wanting to say the name aloud, not wanting to make it more real than it already was. "Just make sure we have solid documentation." The leak moved among the others with obvious authority, checking the loading process, speaking with what appeared to be the operations leadership. This was more than just providing information. This was active participation, direct involvement in the criminal enterprise. The evidence we were gathering wouldn't just prove a security breach. It would prove criminal conspiracy at the highest levels. At 11:52 p.m., the loading was complete. The white van's rear doors closed. The driver returned to his vehicle. The other participants began moving to their cars. The distribution phase was beginning. The product would now scatter across Chicago to the 3 endpoints the source had identified. The West Loop endpoint, I reminded Mercer. That's our target. We need to identify which vehicle is heading there. We watched as the vehicles began departing, each one leaving individually rather than in convoy, spreading out to make surveillance more difficult. The white van went first, heading east on the service road. Then the black sedan. Then the silver SUV, which turned west toward the expressway. The SUV, Mercer said with certainty. That direction matches the route to the West Loop. They'd use Stevenson west to the Kennedy, then south into the target area. Then that's what we follow, I decided. Pack up the equipment, we need to move. We extracted from the maintenance shed, moving quickly but carefully, avoiding the sight lines of the remaining security personnel. Made it back to Mercer's van without incident, pulled out of our observation position and into traffic on Kedzie Avenue. The silver SUV was 3 blocks ahead, visible in the sparse late-night traffic. We followed at a distance, using other vehicles for cover when possible, trying to maintain visual contact without being obvious about it. My phone buzzed with a text from Thais. "Status?" I typed back, "Transfer confirmed. Following distribution vehicle to West Loop. Leak identified on site." Her response came immediately. "Jesus, be careful. Ready to call tactical support on your word." "Stand by," I replied. "We'll advise when in position." The SUV led us on to the Stevenson Expressway, then north on the Kennedy, exactly as Mercer had predicted. We were heading into the West Loop, into the old meatpacking district where massive buildings stood empty and streets were poorly lit, and the city felt like it had been abandoned to decay and shadows. At 12:17 a.m., the SUV exited at Lake Street, drove west into the industrial area. We followed, our van looking like just another commercial vehicle. Nothing suspicious, nothing worth noticing. The SUV made several turns, checking for surveillance with the same professional caution we'd observed all night. Then it pulled into a parking area behind a large brick building, one of the old meatpacking plants that had been shuttered for years. We drove past without slowing, circled the block, found a position where we could observe the building's rear entrance. "Same protocol," I told Mercer. "We document the transfer, identify participants, build the evidence package. When we have enough for arrests and warrants, we call in tactical support." "And if they spot us?" he asked. "Then we adapt," I replied, which wasn't really an answer but was the only one I had. The SUV's occupants, I counted 3 individuals, began unloading boxes from the vehicle, carrying them into the building through a service entrance. The building appeared completely dark from outside, but I caught glimpses of light when the door opened, suggesting they had interior lighting set up for the operation. Mercer deployed his surveillance equipment again, capturing images and audio, documenting the transfer. We were building a complete picture now. The Stevenson primary transfer, the distribution to this West Loop endpoint, the participants at each stage. It was solid evidence, the kind that would support multiple charges against multiple defendants. At 12:33 a.m., the unloading was complete. The 3 individuals entered the building, leaving the SUV empty in the parking area. I expected them to remain inside, to begin whatever distribution or processing happened at this endpoint. Instead, the service door opened again, and a different vehicle emerged from inside the building. A black van, unmarked, that I hadn't seen before. "Where did that come from?" Mercer muttered, zooming his camera on the new vehicle. It was already inside, I realized. This building isn't just a transfer point. It's a storage facility. They've been using it to stage vehicles, keep them out of sight until needed. The black van pulled up to the service entrance, and different people emerged from the building. 4 individuals I didn't recognize from the Stevenson operation. They began loading boxes into the van, but these weren't the same boxes we'd watched being transferred. These were larger, different in appearance, suggesting they'd been repackaged or that this was a different product entirely. "This is bigger than we thought," I said, watching the new operation unfold. "This isn't just tonight's transfer, this is an established distribution hub. They've probably been running operations out of this building for months. Which means there's evidence inside," Mercer said. "Financial records, product inventory, communications equipment. If we can secure this location..." "We need more people," I interrupted. "We can't take down a facility this size with 2 agents. Thais, are you monitoring?" No response on my phone. I tried calling, straight to voicemail. Tried texting, message failed to send. "Communications are down," I reported, feeling the first tendrils of real fear. "I can't reach Thais." Mercer checked his phone, got the same results. "Someone's jamming," he said. "Probably detected our transmission earlier and deployed countermeasures. We're isolated." "Then we make the decision ourselves," I said. "We've got enough evidence for warrants, enough documentation for arrests. We call tactical support, get teams here immediately." "Using what communications?" Mercer asked. "If they're jamming cellular and radio frequencies..." He was interrupted by movement from the building. More people were emerging, and these weren't workers or distributors. These were security personnel, armed, fanning out from the building in a search pattern that included our position. "They know we're here," I breathed. "They've detected the surveillance equipment or spotted our van. They know." "What do we do?" Mercer asked, his hand moving toward his weapon. I looked at the armed personnel spreading out, at the building that contained evidence and criminals, at our van that contained months of investigative work and 2 federal agents who'd made the mistake of thinking they were hunting when they were actually being hunted. "We run," I decided. "Get us out of here now. We'll regroup, find working communications, call for backup from a secure location." Mercer started the van's engine, but before he could put it in gear, a vehicle pulled across the parking lot exit. The silver SUV we'd followed from Stevenson, blocking our escape route. Another vehicle appeared behind us, boxing us in. We were trapped, surrounded by armed personnel who knew we were federal agents, cut off from communications and backup, sitting in a van full of evidence that proved we'd been conducting unauthorized surveillance on a criminal organization sophisticated enough to turn the tables on us. "Secondary exit," Mercer said, pointing to a gap between buildings. "We can make it on foot." "With all the equipment?" I asked. "We leave it," he decided. "Survival first, evidence second." We grabbed our weapons, ensured our body cameras were recording, and prepared to exit the van. Through the windshield, I could see the armed personnel getting closer, moving with tactical precision, coordinating their approach to cut off escape routes. "On 3, I said, "out to the passenger side, between the buildings. Don't stop moving until we reach a populated area or find working communications." 1, Mercer counted. 2, I continued. The passenger door exploded inward with a deafening crash as something, battering ram, breaching tool, impossible to tell, smashed through it. Arms reached in, grabbing, pulling. I tried to fight, tried to draw my weapon, but there were too many of them, too coordinated, too prepared. I felt something impact the side of my head, felt the world tilt and spin, heard Mercer shouting, and then his voice cutting off abruptly. Felt myself being dragged from the van, felt pavement against my back, felt hands securing my wrists with the zip ties. My vision was blurred, my ears ringing, but I could make out figures standing over me. The armed security, the people from the building, and someone else. Someone I recognized even through the haze of pain and disorientation. The leak stood there, looking down at me with an expression that wasn't quite satisfaction, but wasn't quite concern either. Just cold professional assessment, the look of someone evaluating a problem and determining the solution. "Get them inside," the leak said, their voice distorted by the ringing in my ears. "We'll figure out what they know and who they've told. Then we'll deal with them permanently." I tried to speak, tried to shout that others knew where we were, that backup was coming, anything that might make them hesitate. But my mouth wouldn't form words. My thoughts were fragmenting, consciousness slipping away like water through my fingers. The last thing I saw before darkness took me was the building's service entrance opening again, revealing a dark interior that swallowed light and sound and hope. I woke to the smell of old meat and industrial cleaner, a combination that turned my stomach even before I opened my eyes. My head throbbed where I'd been struck, and when I tried to move my hands, I found them secured behind my back with what felt like metal cuffs. Not zip ties anymore, but actual handcuffs, police grade. My feet were bound too, rope or cord wrapped around my ankles and tied to something fixed behind me. I was sitting in a chair in the middle of a large room, the concrete floor beneath me stained with substances I didn't want to identify. When my vision cleared enough to see properly, I understood where they'd brought us. The room was part of the old meatpacking plant's processing floor, hooks still hanging from overhead rails, drainage grates set into the floor at regular intervals, tile walls that could be hosed down when they got too dirty. It was a space designed for butchering, where the systematic dismantling of carcasses and the implications of being held here weren't lost on me. Mercer was in a similar chair about 10 feet to my left, still unconscious, blood running from a cut above his eyebrow. His equipment case sat on a table against the far wall, opened, its contents spread out for examination. Our service weapons were there too, along with our credentials, phones, and body cameras. Everything that identified us as federal agents, everything that documented what we'd witnessed, laid out like evidence in a case against us. The room's only door opened, and 3 people entered. 2 I didn't recognize, armed with handguns visible in hip holsters, and the 3rd I knew all too well. The leak approached me with measured steps, carrying a tablet computer, their expression unreadable in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "You're awake," they observed, setting the tablet on a folding table someone had positioned near my chair. "That's good. We have a lot to discuss and limited time to do it." I tried to speak, found my throat raw and dry, managed to croak out, "You're finished. Other agents know where we are, backup is already en route. You can't—" "Please don't insult both of us with lies," the leak interrupted, their tone almost weary. "If other agents knew your location, if backup was coming, they would have arrived by now. The truth is, you've been running an unauthorized investigation, operating outside official channels, specifically because you suspected there was a security breach, which means nobody knows where you are. Nobody's coming to help." The accuracy of their assessment hit harder than the blow that had knocked me unconscious. They were right. We'd been so careful to avoid official channels, so determined to prevent the leak from learning our plans, that we'd isolated ourselves completely. Thais knew we'd been heading to the West Loop, but she didn't have a specific location, didn't know which building we'd identified as the distribution endpoint. And with communications jammed, she had no way to track us or coordinate a rescue. "What do you want?" I asked, abandoning the pretense. Information, the leak replied, pulling up something on the tablet. You've been investigating this operation for 9 months. You've gathered intelligence, conducted surveillance, compiled evidence. I need to know the full scope of what you've discovered, what you've documented, and most importantly, who else has seen it. And if I tell you, you'll let us go? The question came out more bitter than I'd intended. No, they said with surprising honesty. But I might make your deaths quick instead of prolonged. That's the only negotiation available. One of the armed guards shifted position slightly, and I caught a better look at their face. Younger than the leak, early 30s maybe, with the kind of empty expression that suggested either profound indifference or carefully cultivated detachment. A professional, someone who'd done this before, who wouldn't hesitate when ordered to kill. I'm not telling you anything, I said, forcing my voice to remain steady despite the fear clawing at my chest. The leak sighed, almost disappointed. I suspected as much. Federal agents, trained to resist interrogation, committed to protecting sources and methods even at personal cost. Admirable, really, but ultimately futile. They gestured to one of the guards. Wake the other one. The guard moved to Mercer, slapped him hard across the face once, then, and again. Mercer's eyes opened, unfocused at first, then sharpening as awareness returned, and he understood the situation we were in. He looked at me, at the leak, at the guards, and I watched him arrive at the same conclusions I had. We were alone, we were trapped, and our chances of survival were vanishingly small. Here's what's going to happen, the leak said, addressing both of us now. I'm going to ask questions. You're going to answer them. If you refuse, if you lie, if you provide incomplete information, I'm going to have my associates demonstrate the various ways they can inflict pain without causing death. And this being a former meat processing facility, they have access to quite a variety of tools for that purpose. They pulled up a document on the tablet, showed it to me. It was a surveillance report from 6 months ago, one I'd written myself, detailing observed activity at a warehouse in the Calumet Industrial Corridor. Seeing my own words on the screen, knowing the leak had read every report I'd filed, had access to every piece of intelligence I'd gathered, it made the betrayal more visceral, more personal. This report mentions a confidential informant, the leak continued. Code designation CS-47. The informant provided information about shipping schedules and cargo manifests. I need their identity. No, I said immediately. The leak nodded to one of the guards, who moved behind my chair. I felt something cold against my neck. Metal, thin, sharp. A blade of some kind, pressed just firmly enough that I could feel it, but not hard enough to cut. Yet. The informant's identity, the leak repeated. I don't know it, I said, which was technically true. CS-47 had been handled by another agent, someone who'd since transferred to a different field office. I'd only seen the informant's reports, never met them personally, never learned their true identity. The information was compartmentalized. Different agents handled different sources. The blade pressed harder, and I felt a thin line of blood run down my neck. Not a serious cut, just a warning, a demonstration of what they were willing to do. The guard, holding the knife, was breathing steadily, calmly, without apparent emotion or hesitation. I believe you, the leak said after a moment of consideration. They made a gesture, and the blade withdrew. But here's the problem. You do know other things. You know which agents were assigned to which aspects of the investigation. You know where surveillance equipment is deployed. You know the locations of safe houses and the identities of other confidential sources, even if not CS-47 specifically. And I need all of it. Why? The question came from Mercer. his voice rough but steady. "You've already compromised the investigation. Already protected your organization from law enforcement action. What more do you need?" The leak looked at him with something that might have been respect. "Because the investigation hasn't been compromised, it's been managed. There's a difference. I've been feeding you misdirection, certainly, steering you away from critical operations. But I haven't been able to shut down the investigation entirely without raising suspicions. Now, however, with you two having conducted an unauthorized operation, with you having violated protocols and worked outside official channels, when you disappear, when you're found dead in what will appear to be a gangland execution, the entire investigation will be scrutinized. Every piece of evidence you gathered will be questioned. Every informant you cultivated will be exposed to potential retaliation. The case will collapse under the weight of procedural violations and security concerns. And you walk away clean," I said, understanding the full scope of their plan. "The investigation dies with us, your organization continues operating, and you maintain your position inside the Bureau." "Exactly," the leak confirmed. "But to ensure that outcome, I need to identify every potential loose end, every thread that might be pulled to unravel things later. Which means you're going to tell me everything. Not because you want to, but because the alternative is watching your partner die slowly while you listen to him scream." They gestured again, and both guards moved, one positioning themselves behind Mercer's chair, the other beginning to lay out tools on the folding table. Pliers, box cutters, other implements I couldn't identify in the harsh lighting. The methodical way they arranged everything suggested experience, routine, the casual efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. My mind raced, searching for options that didn't exist. We were secured, disarmed, isolated. The room had no windows, probably thick walls that would muffle sound. Even if I could free myself from the restraints, even if I could somehow overpower 3 armed opponents, we had no transportation, no communications, no way to reach help before they hunted us down again. But I'd been trained for this, not the specific scenario but the mental framework. Survive, resist, escape. Provide minimal information, buy time, wait for opportunities. Even in impossible situations, even when death seemed inevitable, you maintained discipline and looked for the opening that might come. "I'll tell you what I know," I said slowly, the lie forming as I spoke it. "But not while my partner is being threatened. You want information? Fine. But you deal with me alone, send the guards and Mercer somewhere else." The leak studied me for a long moment, then shook their head. "No, you'll tell me everything with him present, so you can see the consequences of resistance. That's not negotiable." "Then we have a problem," I replied, "because I'm not cooperating while he's in danger." It was a gambit, a desperate attempt to change the dynamic, to create some kind of leverage where none existed. The leak understood that, could probably see through the tactic, but they also needed information and needed it quickly. The longer they kept us here, the greater the risk that something would go wrong, that Thais would find a way to track us, that the communications jamming would fail, that some unforeseen variable would compromise their plan. "Fine," the leak said after a pause. "We'll start with something simple, something that doesn't require your partner's presence to verify. The recording you made yesterday in the factory. Who else has heard it?" The recording. In the chaos of capture, I'd almost forgotten about the audio I'd captured. The conversation between the organization's leadership discussing tonight's operation. That evidence was on my phone, which was currently sitting on the table with the other confiscated items. If the leak had accessed it, if they'd listened to the recording, they'd know it contained enough to build a criminal conspiracy case. "Just me," I lied. I haven't had a chance to share it yet." "You're lying," the leak said flatly. "You wouldn't have conducted tonight's operation based solely on one piece of evidence. You would have shared it with your partners, possibly with supervision." "Who heard it?" Before I could answer, Mercer spoke up. "O'Rourke. She heard it, and she sent a copy to the assistant special agent in charge." I turned to look at him, trying to understand what he was doing. The information was partially true. Thais had heard the recording, but the second part was a fabrication. We hadn't sent anything to the ASAC, hadn't brought anyone else into our operational loop. Mercer was lying, creating false trails for the leak to chase. The leak's expression tightened, stress breaking through their professional composure. "The ASAC has the recording." "Time-stamped email," Mercer continued, his voice gaining confidence as he built the lie. "Sent at 1900 hours yesterday with instructions to open it if O'Rourke didn't make contact by 0600 hours tomorrow. So even if you kill us, even if you make this whole thing look like a botched undercover operation, that recording goes public in about 4 hours." It was a brilliant improvisation, the kind of misdirection that might buy us time or create enough uncertainty to make the leak hesitate. But it was also incredibly dangerous. If they believed it, they might accelerate their timeline, might decide to kill us immediately and deal with the fallout rather than waste time on interrogation. The leak pulled out their phone, made a call, spoke quietly, urgently to whoever answered. I couldn't hear the other side of the conversation, but I watched the leak's body language shift from controlled to agitated, their free hand gesturing as they spoke. The call lasted maybe 90 seconds, then ended abruptly. "Change of plans," the leak announced to the guards. "We're moving them to the secondary location. If there's a time-delayed email, if evidence is going to surface regardless of what we do here, then we need more sophisticated disposal methods. Load them into the van." The guards moved to comply, one of them cutting the ropes binding my feet to the chair while keeping the handcuffs in place. They hauled me upright, muscles cramping from the restraints and the position I'd been held in. Mercer received similar treatment, both of us unsteady on our feet but mobile enough to be moved. As they marched us toward the door, I caught Mercer's eye. He gave the slightest nod, almost imperceptible, and I understood. His lie had bought us something. Not safety, not rescue, but time and uncertainty. The leak was reacting instead of controlling, making decisions under pressure instead of following a carefully prepared plan. And in that reaction, in that pressure, there might be an opening. They loaded us into the back of a panel van, the same black one we'd seen earlier receiving repackaged product. The cargo area was empty, except for plastic sheeting covering the floor, the kind of preparation you made when you expected blood and wanted easy cleanup afterward. One guard climbed in with us, weapon drawn, while the other took the driver's seat. The leak got into a separate vehicle, a sedan that pulled out ahead of the van. The van's engine started and we began moving, leaving the meatpacking plant behind. Through the van's rear windows, I could see the Chicago skyline in the distance. Lights still burning despite the late hour. The city continuing its existence unaware that 2 federal agents were being transported to their execution. "Where do you think they're taking us?" Mercer whispered, barely audible over the engine noise. "Somewhere isolated," I replied quietly. "Probably outside the city, somewhere they can dispose of bodies without immediate discovery." The guard, watching us, shifted his weapon. "Shut up," he ordered, but didn't elaborate on the threat. We rode in silence for maybe 20 minutes, the city gradually giving way to industrial outskirts, and then to darker, more isolated areas. I tried to track our route based on turns and time, but with my limited view and disorientation from the earlier blow to my head, I couldn't determine our location with any certainty. The van finally stopped, and I heard gravel crunching under the tires. The rear doors opened, revealing a landscape I hadn't expected. We were at what looked like a marina or boat launch area on the Chicago River, the water dark and still, reflecting city lights from miles away. Isolated, yes, but not the rural disposal site I'd anticipated. "Out," the guard commanded, and we complied awkwardly, our bound hands making movement difficult. The leak was waiting by the water's edge, standing near a small motorboat tied to a dock that had seen better days. The setup became clear. They were going to take us out onto the river, probably to a point where the water was deep enough that weighted bodies wouldn't surface easily or soon. "Load them into the boat," the leak instructed. As the guards moved us toward the dock, I heard something that made my heart leap. A helicopter, distant but approaching. The leak heard it too, turned to look toward the sound, their expression shifting from controlled to concerned. "Police or news?" one of the guards asked. "Can't tell yet," the leak replied, pulling out binoculars to scan the sky. "But we need to move faster. Get them in the boat now." The guards became rougher, shoving us towards the dock, but the helicopter sound was getting louder, closer. Then I saw searchlights cutting through the darkness, the distinctive spotlight pattern of law enforcement aircraft. "It's FBI," the leak said, the binoculars still pressed to their eyes. Someone called it in. Someone knew where to look. Thais, it had to be Thais. When communications went dark, when we didn't check in, she'd made the call we'd authorized, brought in tactical support, coordinated a search, somehow tracked us to this location. The jamming must have failed, or she'd found another way to locate us, some method the organization hadn't anticipated. "Abort," the leak decided. "Leave them. We'll deal with this differently. Everyone back to your vehicles." But it was too late for clean escape. The helicopter was overhead now, spotlight sweeping across the marina, and I could hear vehicles approaching on the access road. Multiple vehicles moving fast. The cavalry arriving just when we needed them most. The guards looked uncertain, caught between following orders and self-preservation instincts. One of them made the decision to run, sprinting toward the van. The other raised his weapon, and I realized with horror that he was aiming at Mercer. If they couldn't dispose of us quietly, they'd do it loudly and deal with the consequences. I threw myself sideways, shoulder-checking Mercer and knocking him to the ground as the shot rang out. The bullet passed through the space where his head had been a second earlier, and then everything dissolved into chaos. More gunshots, but not from the guard. From different directions, different weapons. The FBI tactical team had arrived, was engaging the armed subjects. I heard commands being shouted, heard the guard who'd shot at us cry out and go down, heard vehicle engines and helicopter rotors and the general chaos of a law enforcement operation in progress. Mercer and I stayed down, making ourselves small targets while secured in handcuffs we couldn't remove. I saw the leak running toward the sedan, saw them almost reach it before being intercepted by agents in tactical gear. Saw them go down, face first into the gravel, being secured and cuffed while they shouted something I couldn't hear over the noise. Then someone was beside us, an agent I didn't recognize, cutting our restraints, helping us to our feet. "You're safe," they were saying. "Medics are en route. You're safe now." Safe. The word seemed impossible, seemed like something from a different reality. Minutes ago, we'd been facing execution, had been processing our own impending deaths. Now we were standing in a marina surrounded by federal agents while the people who'd planned to kill us were being arrested. Thais appeared, running toward us with an expression that mixed relief and fury. "You idiots," she said, but there was no real anger in it. Just the adrenaline crash of someone who'd been operating on pure determination and was finally allowing themselves to feel. You stupid, reckless idiots. How did you find us? I asked, my voice rough. The body cameras, she replied. When communications went dark, when you didn't respond to check-in protocols, I accessed the Bureau's equipment tracking system. Your cameras were still transmitting GPS coordinates, even though the audio and video feeds were jammed. I tracked you to the meatpacking plant, then to here. Called in every tactical asset within 50 miles and told them we had agents in immediate danger. The ASAC? Mercer asked. Furious, Thais confirmed. But that's a problem for tomorrow. Right now, you're both alive, the suspects are in custody, and we've got enough evidence to dismantle this entire organization. Paramedics arrived, began checking our injuries despite our protests that we were fine. I had a concussion, several lacerations, bruised ribs. Mercer had similar damage plus a fractured cheekbone. We were alive, functional, and incredibly lucky. I watched as the leak was loaded into a Bureau vehicle, hands cuffed behind their back. Career and freedom both ending in this gravel parking lot by the Chicago River. They looked at me as they passed, and I saw something in their expression. Not remorse, not shame, but a kind of exhausted resignation. The look of someone who'd gambled everything and lost. The sun was beginning to rise over Lake Michigan, the first light of dawn breaking across the city. We'd been working this case for 9 months, had nearly died in the final hours, but we'd succeeded. The organization was compromised, its leadership in custody, its operations exposed. But as I stood there watching the sunrise, feeling the aches and pains of the night catching up with me, I couldn't shake a sense of unease. We'd won this battle, caught the criminals, exposed the leak. But the leak had said something that stuck with me, that the investigation had been managed, not compromised, that they'd been steering us, controlling our perceptions, feeding us carefully curated misdirection. How much of what we'd discovered had been real, and how much had been another layer of deception? How many other leaks might exist? Other people in positions of trust who'd made the same choice to betray their oath? How many operations were still running, still moving contraband through the city while we celebrated a victory that might be smaller than we believed? What are you thinking? Thais asked, standing beside me as the tactical teams finished securing the scene. I'm thinking this isn't over, I replied. We caught one network, exposed one betrayal. But there are others, there have to be. The level of sophistication we saw, the resources they had access to, the institutional knowledge they demonstrated, that doesn't come from one person or one organization. It's bigger. Maybe, she conceded. But that's not our problem today. Today we did our job. We protected sources. We gathered evidence. We survived when we probably shouldn't have. Tomorrow, next week, next month, we can worry about the bigger picture then. She was right, pragmatically speaking. But I couldn't stop thinking about the boxes we'd watched being transferred, about the distribution network that spanned the entire city, about the secondary vehicle we'd seen at the meatpacking plant loading different product for different destinations. We'd interrupted one night's operation, but the infrastructure remained. The demand remained. The profit motive remained. The assistant special agent in charge arrived on scene around 6:30 a.m., her expression grim as she surveyed the chaos. She spoke with the tactical team leaders, reviewed the preliminary evidence, then approached where Mercer, Thais, and I were sitting in the back of an ambulance receiving treatment. You 3 are on administrative leave effective immediately, she said without preamble. Pending review of your unauthorized operation, your decision to work outside official channels, and your failure to follow established protocols. There will be an internal investigation, there will be consequences, and there will be significant paperwork. Yes, ma'am, we replied in unison. That said, she continued, her expression softening slightly, you broke this case. You identified the leak, you documented the criminal enterprise, You gathered evidence that will support prosecution of multiple subjects on multiple charges. It was reckless, it was dangerous, and it violated pretty much every operational guideline in the manual. But it worked. She paused, looking at each of us in turn. The source, the confidential informant, he's being processed for witness protection right now. New identity, new location, everything he needs to stay alive. The organization's leadership is in custody. The leak will spend the rest of their life in federal prison. And the case files you've built over 9 months? They're solid. They'll hold up in court. What about the distribution network? I asked. The endpoints we didn't cover, the operations that are still running. Follow-up investigations are already being initiated, the ASAC replied. Based on the evidence you gathered, we're executing search warrants across the city. The Stevenson warehouse, the West Loop facility, properties connected to the shell corporations, all of it. We're dismantling the network piece by piece. It should have felt like victory. It should have felt like justice. But all I felt was tired, bone-deep exhaustion that went beyond the physical injuries and the sleepless night. I thought about the source, about how he'd risked everything to provide information, about how close he'd come to being discovered and killed. Thought about all the other potential sources out there, people who might have information about criminal activity but were too afraid to come forward because they knew what happened to informants. The ASAC must have seen something in my expression because she added, "You did good work, Dunleavy. All 3 of you. You should be proud." "Thank you, ma'am," I replied. But the words felt automatic, rehearsed. She left to coordinate with the other agencies now arriving on scene. Chicago PD, DEA, other bureau divisions drawn by the scope of the operation. We sat in the ambulance, watching the sun continue its rise, watching the city wake up to a day that would seem normal to most people, but had nearly been our last. "I need to ask you something," Mercer said after a long silence. "When we were in that room, when they were going to torture us for information, would you have told them anything? To save me, I mean, would you have given them what they wanted?" I thought about it. About the impossible choice between betraying sources and watching a partner suffer. Thought about all the scenarios we'd trained for, all the ethical frameworks and decision trees that were supposed to guide us in extreme situations. "I don't know," I admitted. "I'd like to think I would have resisted, would have maintained operational security no matter what. But honestly, I don't know what I would have done when they started hurting you, and I'm glad we didn't have to find out." "Me too," he said quietly. Thais had been silent, processing everything that had happened. Now she spoke, her voice thoughtful. "The leak said something interesting. They said the investigation had been managed, not compromised, that they'd been steering us, controlling what we discovered. Do you think that's true? Do you think we only found what they wanted us to find?" It was the same question that had been nagging at me, the same unease I couldn't shake. "I think we found enough," I replied. "Maybe not everything, maybe not the complete picture, but enough to make a difference, enough to disrupt their operations, enough to put dangerous people in prison. Is that enough for you?" she asked. I looked at the marina, at the boat that would have been our tomb, if not for Thais's quick thinking and the tactical team's rapid response. Looked at the city beyond, vast and complex, and hiding countless secrets beneath its ordinary surface. Thought about all the cases I'd worked over 9 years, all the times I'd felt like we'd made a difference, and all the times I'd wondered if we were just scratching the surface of problems too big to solve. "It has to be," I said finally, "because it's all we've got." We were transported back to the field office around 8 a.m., cleaned up, interviewed by internal affairs investigators who were already building their case file on our unauthorized operation. The interviews were professional but pointed, each question designed to understand not just what we'd done, but why we'd done it outside official channels. I told them everything: the pattern we'd identified in the access logs, the decision to operate independently to avoid the leak, the intelligence we'd gathered from the confidential source. Told them about the recording, about following the distribution vehicle, about being captured and nearly executed. Left out nothing, accepted full responsibility for every decision I'd made. By noon, we were done with the preliminary interviews and released on administrative leave pending the full investigation. We were told not to discuss the case with anyone, not to access bureau systems or files, not to conduct any investigative activity whatsoever. Standard protocol for situations like this, designed to preserve the integrity of both the criminal case and the internal review. I drove home in the early afternoon, exhausted beyond words, my head still pounding from the concussion. The city looked different somehow, or maybe I was different, changed by the proximity to death and the knowledge of how fragile our safety really was. People went about their days, unaware that federal agents had nearly been murdered in a marina less than 12 hours ago, unaware of the criminal networks operating beneath the surface of normal life. My phone rang as I pulled into my apartment parking lot. Thais calling. "Hey," I answered. "Hey yourself," she replied. "You doing okay? Physically or mentally?" "Either, both. I'm alive," I said. "That's about the best I can offer right now." "Same," she agreed. "Listen, I know we're not supposed to discuss the case, but I wanted to say, what we did, the way we handled it, I'm proud of that. We took risks, we made choices that could have ended badly, but we did it for the right reasons. And it almost got us killed," I pointed out. "Almost," she emphasized. "But it didn't, and because of what we did, because of those risks, we stopped something terrible. We saved the source, we caught the leak, we disrupted a major criminal operation. That counts for something." "Yeah," I agreed, though I wasn't sure I believed it yet. Maybe in time, maybe after some distance, I'd be able to see it that way. But right now, I just felt tired. "Get some rest," Thais said. "We'll talk more later, when we're allowed to. But Alaric, we're going to be okay. All of us." The call ended and I sat in my car, looking at my apartment building, at the normal, mundane existence waiting for me beyond the windshield. Thought about showers and sleep and the luxury of being alive to experience them. But I also thought about the questions that remained unanswered. The secondary vehicle at the meatpacking plant loading different product, the distribution endpoints we hadn't covered, the leak's insistence that they'd been managing the investigation rather than just compromising it. All the threads we'd pulled that might lead to other cases, other networks, other betrayals. The case was closed officially. The suspects were in custody, the evidence was documented, the immediate threat was neutralized. But investigations had a way of opening new questions even as they answered old ones, of revealing that what you thought was the whole picture was just one small part of something larger. I got out of my car and walked toward my apartment, each step reminding me of injuries sustained, of how close I'd come to not making this walk at all. But I was here, alive, and that had to be enough for now. Tomorrow, or next week, or whenever the administrative leave ended and we were cleared to return to duty, there would be new cases. New criminals to catch, new networks to dismantle, new decisions to make about how far to push and when to pull back. The work would continue because it had to, because someone needed to stand between the predators and their prey. But tonight, I would rest, would let my body heal and my mind process what we'd survived, would allow myself the small victory of having made it through when the odds suggested we shouldn't have. Because in the end, that's what the job came down to. Surviving long enough to fight again, to make a difference again, to maintain the thin line between order and chaos, even when that line became almost invisible. I unlocked my apartment door, stepped inside, and closed it behind me. Safe, for now. Alive, despite everything. It would have to be enough.